The Nile moves at night the way a secret moves through a room, slowly, silently, and with the weight of everything it carries beneath the surface. Imagine standing on the eastern bank of the great river, somewhere in the last decades before the world was numbered by a new calendar, a new faith, a new way of reckoning time. The air is warm and still. The sky above you is enormous, more enormous than you have ever seen it in your own century, because there are no electric lights here, no glow from distant cities blurring the edges of the darkness, no haze of human industry dimming the stars. The sky here is pure and deep and vast, and the stars are not scattered randomly but seem deliberately placed, as if arranged by a hand that understood geometry and beauty in equal measure. The Great Bear wheels slowly overhead. Orion stands on the horizon. The Milky Way is not an abstraction but a visible river of light, arching from one dark edge of the world to the other, and the people of this place have names for all of it, have been mapping and measuring and interpreting the movements of those lights for 3,000 years. The date palms along the bank are motionless. There is no wind. There is only the sound of water, unhurried and ancient, moving past you in the darkness toward the sea. The Nile in the darkness is black and silver, black where the depth catches no light and silver where the stars are reflected on the surface. It smells of minerals and river plants and the rich dark memory of 1,000 floods. It smells of time. Somewhere downriver, perhaps a half-hour's walk through fragrant gardens and lamplit colonnades, a city glitters. Alexandria. Even the name carries weight, carries a kind of compressed history. It is a city that was dreamed before it was built, designed by a young Macedonian king who stood on this very coastline, on this very stretch of flat delta sand, and saw in his imagination the most magnificent city in the world. He was 25 years old. He had already conquered most of the known world. He stood there in the Egyptian sun and looked at the featureless coastline and said, "Here." He drew the outline himself with a handful of grain, they say, the grain running out before he had finished, and someone saying this was an omen of abundance, that the city would feed the world. He never lived to see it completed. He died 3 years later in Babylon, thousands of miles to the east, at 32 years old, possibly of typhoid fever, possibly of poison, possibly of grief at the death of his closest companion. He was Alexander of Macedon, and the city he had sketched in grain on a Mediterranean beach rose anyway, after his death, gleaming and enormous, a testament to the idea that a vision does not require its visionary to survive in order to become real. The city was named Alexandria. There were several cities named Alexandria. He founded them across the world he conquered, from Egypt to Afghanistan, but this one, the one on the Mediterranean, the one at the mouth of the Nile, became the one that mattered most, the one that would endure. And inside that city, in a palace complex so vast it occupied a full quarter of the urban space, in chambers filled with the smell of Kifi incense and the soft sound of fountains and the whispered consultation of advisors and the distant murmur of the harbor at night, a woman is thinking. She is not yet 30 years old. She is the ruler of the most ancient civilization on earth. She speaks 9 languages, not conversationally, not haltingly, but with fluency, with diplomatic precision, with the ability to detect the exact shade of meaning in a phrase that a translator would have softened or missed. She understands mathematics and astronomy and philosophy and the mechanics of power with a precision that would astonish men twice her age and experience. She has already survived 2 attempts to remove her from the throne. She has already navigated one of the most dangerous political situations in the ancient world and emerged not as a vassal, not as a client, but as an equal. She is about to do it again. Her name is Cleopatra. Not the Cleopatra of the paintings. Not the Cleopatra of the films. Not the half-naked figure on a gilded barge, draped in silk, designed to seduce, though that scene will come in its own time and in its own context, and it will be rather different from the way it is usually imagined. This is the other Cleopatra. The real one. The one the ancient sources hint at but rarely quite explain in full. The one who read the sacred texts of Isis in the original hieroglyphic script, in the ancient sacred writing that her own dynasty had never bothered to learn. The one whose court physicians produced medical treatises. The one who understood, with the clarity of a strategist and the depth of a scholar, that culture and language and religion were not merely the expression of power but its very instrument, its deepest foundation. This is the story of that woman. Tonight we are going to walk slowly through her world, through her life, through the extraordinary circumstances that made her who she was, and through the equally extraordinary circumstances that ended what she had built. We are going to take our time. There is no hurry tonight. The Nile is moving at its own pace and so are we. This is a story worth knowing and worth carrying with you gently into sleep. If you enjoy tonight's journey through history, subscribe so you never miss a new story. Now close your eyes and let's begin. To understand Cleopatra, you must first understand Egypt itself. Not the Egypt of later centuries, not the Egypt of the medieval Arab caliphates or of the Ottoman Empire or of the 19th century European travelers who came to stare at the pyramids. Not even the Egypt of the classical Greeks, who tended to describe it with a mixture of wonder and exoticism that told you more about the Greeks than about the Egyptians. But Egypt as it existed in the 1st century before the Common Era, a country that was simultaneously the oldest continuous civilization on Earth and one of the most cosmopolitan, dynamic and intellectually vibrant places in the ancient Mediterranean world. Egypt, by the time Cleopatra was born, had been a recognizable political and cultural entity for more than 3,000 years. 3,000 years. To put that in perspective, the same distance in time separates us today from the founding of Rome, from the construction of the Parthenon in Athens, from the life of Confucius in China. Everything that we call Western civilization, the Greeks, the Romans, the medieval period, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the entire sweep of the modern world as we know it, fits inside the lifespan of ancient Egyptian civilization with room to spare. When Cleopatra was born, the Great Pyramid at Giza was already 2,500 years old. The temples at Karnak and Luxor were already ancient. The hieroglyphic writing system had been in continuous use for 3 millennia. The mythology of Isis and Osiris and Horus and Ra had been told and retold and refined and elaborated across more generations than any living person could count. The annual flooding of the Nile, that miraculous and terrifying and life-giving surge of water that spread fertile silt across the delta fields every summer, had been happening since before the first pharaoh raised the double crown above his head and declared himself the living god of the two lands. This was the world Cleopatra inherited. Not just a kingdom in the political sense, a territory with borders and a capital and an army and a tax base, but a civilization. A way of understanding the world that had been developing and refining itself for 3,000 years. By the time Cleopatra was born, Egypt had been ruled by her family, the Ptolemaic dynasty, for nearly 300 years. And the Ptolemies were not Egyptian by blood. They were Macedonian. They were the descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals, a man named Ptolemy who had been clever enough, and far-sighted enough, after Alexander's death in 323 BCE, to secure Egypt for himself while the rest of the empire tore itself apart. The story of how Alexander's empire fragmented after his death is one of the great political sagas of the ancient world. He died without a clear heir, without a designated successor, without having made any clear arrangement for what would happen to the enormous territory he had conquered, stretching from Macedonia in the west to the borders of India in the east. His generals, the men who had served him for years and who had ridden beside him through every campaign, immediately began competing for the pieces. These men were called the Diadochi, the successors, and their wars lasted for decades, reshaping the political map of the ancient world in ways that would endure for centuries. By the time the dust settled, the empire had fragmented into several large kingdoms, each controlled by a different Macedonian dynasty. Ptolemy chose Egypt. He chose it with care and with calculation. Egypt was, in political and economic terms, something extraordinary. It was not just wealthy, though it was staggeringly wealthy, its agricultural output supported by the annual Nile flood making it the most productive agricultural land in the ancient world. It was also geographically defensible in a way few other territories were. The desert on 3 sides and the Mediterranean on the 4th meant that an enemy army had very few routes into the country, and all of those routes were difficult. Egypt could be defended by a relatively small force if the defenders were smart about it. But more than that, Egypt was an idea. It was the most ancient and the most sacred place in the known world. Its pharaohs had been worshipped as gods, not merely revered as powerful rulers, but genuinely understood to be divine, to be the living embodiment of Horus, the son of the sun god, the intermediary between the human world and the divine world. Its priests held the accumulated wisdom of 30 centuries. Its temples were among the most magnificent structures ever built by human hands. Its mythology and its religion had spread, in various forms, throughout the Mediterranean world. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled not just a piece of land but a piece of the world's imagination. Ptolemy understood this. And he did something brilliant. He didn't simply conquer Egypt in the way a military commander conquers a territory, taking its wealth, imposing his own administrative structures, treating the local population as subjects to be taxed and managed. He went much further than that. He became Egypt. He took on the traditional titles of the pharaoh, not just the political title of king, but the full religious and ceremonial apparatus of Egyptian sacred kingship. He presented himself in the ancient iconographic style, the double crown representing authority over both Upper and Lower Egypt, the crook and flail that had been the symbols of royal power since the earliest dynasties, the stylized profile that appeared on temple walls, the hieroglyphic inscriptions that placed him within the long chain of divine rulers stretching back to the mythological time when Osiris himself had ruled the land. He built temples. He restored temples that had fallen into disrepair. He patronized the Egyptian priesthood. He made offerings to the Egyptian gods in the traditional Egyptian manner, participating in the ancient rituals that maintained the relationship between the human world and the divine. He worshipped Ammon-Ra and Osiris and Isis and Horus alongside the Greek gods he had grown up with, embracing both traditions simultaneously. He made Alexandria the new capital, a city that was Hellenic in its architecture and its intellectual culture, with its great library and its philosophical schools and its theater and its gymnasium, but Egyptian in its sacred geography, positioned at the mouth of the Nile as if the river itself were offering the city to the sea, as if the oldest civilization in the world were presenting its most magnificent gift to the Mediterranean world that surrounded it. He was, in all of this, making a statement: I am not a conqueror passing through. I am here. I belong here. This is my civilization now and I will tend it. His descendants continued this strategy with varying degrees of commitment and varying degrees of success. The Ptolemies intermarried, siblings and cousins and sometimes uncle and niece or aunt and nephew, following the ancient Egyptian royal tradition that kept divine blood concentrated within the family. This practice, which horrified Greek and Roman observers who encountered it, had deep theological roots in Egyptian tradition. The pharaoh was divine, and divinity should not be diluted by marriage with ordinary human blood. The gods themselves married within their own families. Osiris and Isis were brother and sister. The sacred bloodline was maintained by following divine example. But the practice also had predictable consequences for a dynasty of human beings rather than gods. The concentration of the bloodline produced, over the generations, a certain amount of dynastic instability. There were brilliant rulers and there were weak ones. There were rulers of genuine intelligence and genuine wisdom, and there were rulers who were paranoid or violent or easily manipulated or simply unlucky. The history of the Ptolemaic court is filled with intrigue, with poisonings and exiles and coups and counter-coups, with brothers who murdered their brothers and mothers who conspired against their sons and sisters who outmaneuvered their sisters and daughters who waited patiently for their fathers to die. It was a world of extraordinary privilege and extraordinary danger, often at the same time. It was into this world that Cleopatra was born, in approximately 69 BCE. The exact date of her birth is not recorded in any surviving ancient source, a reminder that even the most famous figures of antiquity leave gaps in their biographies that no amount of scholarship can entirely fill. But historians place her birth sometime around 69 BCE, most likely in the spring or early summer, most likely in the royal palace complex at Alexandria. The palace sat on a peninsula jutting into the eastern harbor of the city, surrounded by water on 3 sides and by the city's ceaseless energy on the 4th. The gardens and colonnades and libraries and temples and warehouses and workshops and markets of one of the largest and most complex cities in the ancient world. Her father was Ptolemy XII, known to history by the somewhat unflattering nickname Aletes, the flute player. This nickname was given to him by his political enemies and by a population that, at various points, was deeply unhappy with his governance. It was a reference to his genuine love of music and performance. He appears to have been a man who took real pleasure in the arts, who played the aulos, the double flute that was the instrument of Dionysus, the god he identified with most deeply, and it was used by his enemies to suggest that he was more interested in entertainment than in the serious business of governance. This characterization was unfair, or at least incomplete. Ptolemy XII Aletes was a complicated man navigating an extraordinarily complicated situation, and the decisions he made, which looked, from the outside, like weakness and humiliation, were in fact, at least some of the time, the only decisions available to him. The situation was this: Rome. By the 1st century BCE, the Roman Republic had grown into the dominant military and political force in the Mediterranean world. Roman armies had been moving east for more than 2 centuries, absorbing kingdoms and territories with a relentlessness that no individual power could permanently resist. The Macedonian kingdom of Antigonus had fallen. The kingdom of Pergamon had been willed to Rome by its last king. Pontus had been conquered. Syria had become a Roman province. One by one, the successor states of Alexander's empire were being absorbed. Egypt was the great exception. For decades, for generations, Egypt had remained independent, the last major Hellenistic kingdom, the last significant piece of Alexander's world not yet under the Roman eagle. And it had remained independent not because Rome lacked the military power to conquer it. Rome had the military power to conquer almost anything it chose to focus on, but because Egypt was simultaneously too wealthy and too contentious for any single Roman faction to claim without all the others objecting. Rome in the 1st century BCE was itself in profound internal crisis. The Republic was fracturing under the pressure of its own success. The conquest of the Mediterranean world had produced enormous wealth, but that wealth had accumulated in the hands of a relatively small number of Roman aristocrats while the rural poor had been displaced from their traditional lands. The professional army, which had replaced the old citizen militia, was loyal to its generals rather than to the Roman state. Ambitious men, Sulla, Marius, Pompey, Caesar, Crassus, were effectively private warlords competing for power, using their armies as political instruments. In this environment, Egypt was a prize too valuable and too dangerous for anyone to touch unilaterally. Whoever took Egypt would have access to the most productive agricultural land in the ancient world, the granary of the Mediterranean. Whoever took Egypt would be wealthy enough and powerful enough to dominate Roman politics permanently. And that was precisely what nobody wanted anyone else to have. So Egypt survived for a time, in the space created by Roman competition rather than by Roman restraint. It remained independent because the Romans could not agree on who should have it. But its independence was precarious. Every Ptolemaic ruler from roughly the 2nd century BCE onward had to navigate the Roman question with enormous care. Too much resistance to Roman pressure, and Rome might simply decide to act. Too much deference, and a Roman general might calculate that annexation would be easy and uncontested. Ptolemy XII elites understood this better than most. He spent lavish sums that Egypt could barely afford, sums that loaded his kingdom with debt, cultivating relationships with powerful Romans. He paid Julius Caesar, who was at the time establishing himself as a major political force. He paid Pompey, the most successful military commander of his generation. He worked to have Rome formally recognize Egypt's independence, to get the Senate to pass a resolution that acknowledged Egypt as a legitimate kingdom and the Ptolemies as legitimate rulers. He was willing to be humiliated, willing to be treated as a client king rather than an equal, willing to do almost anything because the alternative was worse. In 58 BCE, Rome annexed Cyprus, the island that had been part of the Ptolemaic kingdom for generations. Ptolemy XII did not resist. He could not resist. He had no military force capable of confronting Rome, and he understood this. But the humiliation of accepting the loss of Cyprus without a fight was so profound, so damaging to his authority at home, that it sparked a revolt in Alexandria. He was expelled from his own palace. He fled to Rome to lobby for restoration of his throne. His daughter was watching this. Cleopatra was 11 years old when her father fled Alexandria. 11 years old, and she was watching her father, the king, the living god of Egypt, the embodiment of Horus, running away from his own people. She was watching him arrive in Rome, the foreign city, the overwhelming city, the city that was in the process of consuming the world, and negotiate and plead and pay for the right to return to his own kingdom. She was watching, and she was learning, and she was already forming the understandings that would guide the decisions of her entire reign. Ptolemy XII eventually negotiated his way back. He returned to Egypt in 55 BCE with a Roman military force led by an officer named Aulus Gabinius, reclaimed his throne, and spent the rest of his reign trying to pay back the enormous sums he had borrowed to finance the whole enterprise. Egypt was effectively bankrupt by the time he died, laden with debt to Roman creditors. And the soldiers Gabinius had brought with him, men called the Gabiniani, stayed in Egypt as a garrison force, a tangible reminder of the price of Roman support. Cleopatra watched all of this. She was 11 when he fled and 18 when he died, and in those 7 years she had been given a master class in the realities of power in the 1st century BCE. She had seen how power actually worked, not the ceremonial version, not the divine king on the golden throne version, but the real version. The version where a king begs a foreign city for military support. The version where sovereignty is purchased rather than inherent. The version where the gap between the image of power and its reality can become enormous. She did not intend to be in that position. But before we get to the decisions she made as queen, it is worth spending some time in the world of her childhood and education, because that world was extraordinary, and it shaped who she became in ways that are inseparable from her story. Alexandria in the 1st century BCE was one of the most remarkable cities in the world. By population it was among the largest. Estimates vary, but it was likely home to somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people, making it comparable to Rome in scale. By intellectual culture it had no rival. By commercial importance it was the hub of the Eastern Mediterranean trade networks. By physical beauty it was renowned throughout the ancient world. The city had been planned from its founding, with a grandeur of vision that most cities achieve only accidentally. Its streets were laid out on a grid, broad and straight, meeting at right angles. The two principal thoroughfares were enormous. The ancient accounts say the main east-west street was wide enough for several chariots to pass abreast, and they were lined with colonnades, with the marble columns of public buildings, with the facades of temples and civic structures. The harbor was magnificent, enclosed and protected, one of the finest natural harbors in the Mediterranean, and the island of Pharos was connected to the city by a long man-made causeway called the Heptastadion, the Seven Stades, which divided the harbor into two distinct basins. On the island of Pharos stood the lighthouse. The lighthouse of Alexandria, the Pharos, was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, and it deserved its place on that list. It was enormous by any ancient standard, probably somewhere between 100 and 150 meters tall, the height of a 30 or 40-story modern building. It was constructed in three tiers, a square base, an octagonal middle section, and a cylindrical top. At the very peak burned a fire, and behind the fire was a curved mirror, possibly of polished bronze, that amplified and directed the light so that it could be seen for extraordinary distances across the sea. Ancient sources claim it was visible 45 miles out at sea. Even if that figure is exaggerated, the lighthouse was genuinely functional, not merely symbolic, guiding the enormous volume of merchant shipping that moved through Alexandria's harbor every day and night. The royal palace complex, where Cleopatra grew up, occupied a substantial portion of the northeastern corner of the city, on a peninsula that jutted into the eastern harbor. It was not a single building but a collection of buildings and gardens, accumulated over the generations by successive Ptolemaic rulers who had added their own structures to those of their predecessors. There were audience chambers and banqueting halls and libraries and gardens and colonnades and small temples and the famous museum, the Mouseion, which was the intellectual heart of the city. The Mouseion was an institution unlike anything else in the ancient world. Its name means, literally, the Temple of the Muses, the place of the Muses, the 9 goddesses of learning and the arts. But it was much more than a temple. It was an active research institution, a community of scholars who lived and worked together, supported by royal patronage, with access to the resources of the great library. Scholars at the Mouseion received a stipend from the royal treasury, were exempt from taxes, ate their meals communally, and devoted themselves entirely to their research and their teaching. The Library of Alexandria, which was associated with but separate from the Mouseion, was the most ambitious library project in the history of the ancient world. It was the deliberate attempt by the early Ptolemaic kings to collect every book, every scroll, that had ever been written. In the ancient world, a book was a papyrus scroll, rolled around a rod and stored in a clay pot or a wooden box. The Library of Alexandria collected these scrolls with a systematic thoroughness that was almost pathological in its ambition. Ships that arrived in Alexandria's harbor were searched. Any scroll found on board was confiscated, copied, and the copy returned to the owner while the original was kept for the library. Letters were sent to rulers and scholars and libraries throughout the Mediterranean world, requesting the loan of texts for copying. Every major work of Greek literature, philosophy, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and natural history was represented. Works from Egypt, from Persia, from Babylon, from India were collected and translated into Greek. Agents were dispatched to purchase texts from booksellers in Athens and Rhodes and Rome. At its height, the library held, by ancient accounts, which are probably exaggerated but point toward something real, somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. This was not merely the largest library in the world. It was larger than all other libraries in the world combined. And it was a working institution. The texts were not merely stored but read, studied, annotated, compared, corrected. The scholars of Alexandria developed the practice of textual criticism, the systematic comparison of different versions of the same text to try to recover the original, that is still practiced by classical scholars today. They wrote commentaries. They produced glossaries. They organized the collection into categories, wrote catalogs, created finding aids. Callimachus, one of the great Alexandrian poets, wrote a 120-volume catalog of the library's holdings, a penox, a tablets, listing texts by author and subject, probably the first bibliographic catalog in the history of the world. Archimedes, the greatest mathematician of antiquity, is believed to have visited Alexandria. Eratosthenes of Cyrene served as the chief librarian and, in his spare time, calculated the circumference of the earth using the angle of the sun's shadow in 2 cities at the same moment, arriving at a figure that was within a few % of the actual value, which is extraordinary. Euclid wrote his Elements in Alexandria. The physician Herophilus conducted the first systematic anatomical dissections in the city, discovering the nervous system, distinguishing arteries from veins, identifying the brain as the center of the nervous system rather than the heart. The astronomer Hipparchus made his observations here and produced the first known star catalogue, listing more than 800 stars with their positions. The world, in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, came to Alexandria to think. The physical experience of the library, the experience of being inside it, of moving through its rooms, must have been unlike anything else the ancient world offered. Imagine entering through large doors into a space that smelled of papyrus and the particular dusty sweetness of old writing material and the lamp oil that kept the work going through the evenings. Imagine shelves and boxes and clay pots, each holding its rolled scroll, each labeled in Callimachus's great system of organization. Imagine the sound of pens on papyrus, the soft scratching sound of scribes copying texts, moving the reed pen across the surface of the papyrus with careful, practiced strokes, reproducing in new copies the words that had been written centuries before. Imagine scholars gathered around a single text, arguing in Greek about whether a particular word in an old manuscript was correctly copied or whether it was an error introduced by an earlier scribe. Imagine the occasional laughter of a man who has just found, in a dusty scroll from the far corner of a shelf, a text that no one has read for a century. This was the environment of the world's greatest collection of knowledge, and it was alive. It was not a tomb for old ideas but a working laboratory of human understanding. And Cleopatra grew up in the shadow of this institution. She grew up surrounded by it, by the ideas it had gathered, by the scholars it had drawn, by the culture of learning and inquiry and debate that it had generated. Whether she literally studied in the library's formal precincts is not certain. The sources don't tell us precisely, but she would have had access to its resources in ways that almost no one in history has ever experienced. The accumulated knowledge of the ancient world was, quite literally, available to her. She used it. The ancient sources, primarily Plutarch, writing in the early 2nd century CE, and various later commentators drawing on earlier material, describe Cleopatra's education with a kind of awed admiration that is unusual in ancient discussions of women rulers. They are not describing beauty. They are describing intelligence, specifically applied intelligence, the intelligence of someone who learns with purpose. Plutarch writes that she was the first member of the Ptolemaic dynasty to bother learning the Egyptian language. Her ancestors had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years and had not learned to speak to their own people without an interpreter. Every pharaoh of the Ptolemaic dynasty had required translation to communicate with the priests, the farmers, the merchants, the soldiers who made up the vast majority of the Egyptian population. For 3 centuries, the rulers of Egypt had been foreigners in their own country, separated from their subjects by a language barrier that was simultaneously practical and deeply symbolic. Cleopatra changed this. She learned Egyptian. She learned to read the hieroglyphic script, the sacred writing that had been in use in Egypt for 3,000 years, the script of the temple walls and the royal inscriptions and the sacred texts of the gods. She learned to read and write the demotic script, the more practical everyday form of the Egyptian language used for documents and letters and ordinary communication. And she didn't stop at Egyptian. According to Plutarch, she also learned Ethiopian, Troglodytic, the language of a people who lived along the Red Sea coast, Hebrew, Arabic, Syrian, Median, Parthian, and Latin in addition to her native Greek. Some scholars have debated the extent of this linguistic achievement. 9 languages is a remarkable claim, and there may be some exaggeration in the ancient account. But the consensus among modern scholars is that Cleopatra was genuinely and remarkably multilingual, not merely conversationally functional but diplomatically fluent, capable of receiving foreign ambassadors in their own language, capable of reading diplomatic correspondence in the original, capable of understanding nuances and subtleties that a translation would have flattened. Why does this matter? Why is this worth spending time on? Because language in the ancient world was power. The ability to speak to someone in their own language was not merely a social courtesy in a court context. It was a statement. It said, I have entered your world. I have taken the trouble to learn how you think, how you express yourself, what words carry weight for you and what words do not. I understand your world from the inside, not just from the outside. And because I understand it, I cannot be manipulated within it by people who think I don't understand. For a Ptolemaic ruler, governing a kingdom that included not just native Egyptians but a substantial Greek community, a large Jewish population, Persians, Nubians, Arabs, Nabateans, and many other peoples, each with their own language and their own cultural traditions and their own ways of understanding the world. This linguistic range was an extraordinary political and diplomatic asset. It was also, more personally, a statement about identity and belonging. When Cleopatra learned Egyptian, when she took the trouble that none of her predecessors had taken, she was saying something to the Egyptian people. She was saying, I am yours. I have come to you. I have entered your language and therefore I have entered your world, your tradition, your history. The effect this had cannot be overstated. Imagine a delegation of priests from a great temple in Upper Egypt. Men from Karnak or Edfu or Dendera, men who had dedicated their lives to the ancient rituals and the ancient texts, men who were accustomed to dealing with the Ptolemaic court through layers of translation and bureaucracy, men who understood themselves as the custodians of something sacred and ancient and worth preserving. They make the journey north to Alexandria. They enter the audience chamber of the palace, with its marble columns and its Greek-style decorations and the unmistakable atmosphere of a Hellenistic court. And then the queen begins to speak. In Egyptian. In their language. In the language of Isis and Osiris, of Ammonius Ra and Horus, of the sacred texts they recite every morning before the sun rises. The language that connects them to 3,000 years of their civilization's continuity. The effect must have been extraordinary. The effect must have been like a door opening in a wall that had always been solid. For 300 years, the rulers of Egypt had been powerful but foreign. Now, for the first time, the ruler of Egypt was coming to them. Not waiting for them to come to her, through translation and intermediary and cultural distance, but crossing the distance herself. She was not simply ruling Egypt. She was becoming Egypt. But language was only one dimension of this becoming. There was also religion. The relationship between the Ptolemaic dynasty and the Egyptian religious establishment was complex and politically crucial. The Egyptian temples were not merely places of worship. They were economic institutions of enormous power. They held vast agricultural estates, they employed thousands of people, they controlled significant portions of the Egyptian economy. The high priests of the major temples, of Ammonius at Karnak, of Ptah at Memphis, of Ra at Heliopolis, were men of genuine political importance whose support or opposition could significantly affect a ruler's ability to govern. The priests possessed something no Ptolemaic king could manufacture: antiquity. Their authority derived not from military power or from wealth but from the unbroken continuity of their tradition. They were the custodians of knowledge that stretched back, in some cases, to before the first dynasty. They performed rituals that were already ancient when Alexander arrived in Egypt. They spoke a sacred language, the language of the temple inscriptions, the language of the religious texts, that connected them to the deepest roots of Egyptian civilization. For the Ptolemaic rulers, managing this relationship was always delicate. The priests needed to be honored, patronized, materially supported. The royal building program that maintained and expanded the great temples was not just piety but politics. But the priests also needed to accept the Ptolemaic rulers as legitimate pharaohs, as genuine holders of the sacred royal office, as the rightful intermediaries between the human world and the divine. Earlier Ptolemies had managed this relationship with varying degrees of success. Some had been genuine patrons of the Egyptian religious establishment, building magnificently and participating sincerely in Egyptian religious life. Others had been more perfunctory, maintaining the outward forms without much genuine engagement. Cleopatra engaged with it as no Ptolemaic ruler had before. She held the religious title of Enia Isis, the new Isis, the goddess made flesh. This was not merely an honorific or a political designation. It was a theological claim, and Cleopatra appears to have taken it seriously in a way that went beyond political calculation. The goddess Isis was the most beloved deity in the Egyptian pantheon, perhaps the most beloved figure in the entire religious imagination of the ancient Mediterranean world. She was the wife of Osiris, the god of death and resurrection. She was the mother of Horus, the god of kingship in the sky. She was the great magician, possessor of the secret name of Ra that gave her power over all things. She was the healer, the protector, the faithful wife who had searched the world for the scattered pieces of her murdered husband's body, who had used her magic to bring him back to life long enough to conceive a son, who had then raised that son in secret in the marshes of the Delta, protecting him from his uncle Seth until he was old enough to claim his father's throne. The mythology of Isis was rich and deep and infinitely interpretable. She was a figure who had faced loss and had not been defeated by it. She had faced the murder of the person she loved most, had faced the scattering and dismemberment of everything she held dear, and had gathered it back together piece by piece through wisdom and magic and the sheer force of her love. She had won, not through military power, she was not that kind of goddess, but through intelligence and dedication and the refusal to accept an ending that she had not chosen. For a queen who would spend her reign fighting to hold together an ancient kingdom in the face of overwhelming external pressure, there was something genuinely resonant in this mythology. something that was more than political calculation. There are surviving temple reliefs, most famously at the Great Temple Complex at Dendera in Upper Egypt, on the rear wall that faces the back of the sanctuary, that show Cleopatra in the traditional pharaonic style. The double crown, the ritual garments, the stylized formal posture of the royal offering. She is making offerings before the goddess Hathor, accompanied by Caesarion, the son she would have with Julius Caesar. The carving is large and formal and precise, executed in the ancient Egyptian style that had been in continuous use for 3,000 years. It communicates something simple and important. This queen belongs here. This queen is not an outsider, not a foreigner using Egyptian religious imagery as a political tool, but a genuine participant in the ancient tradition. She is the pharaoh. She is performing the sacred duty that is inseparable from the royal office. She is maintaining the relationship between the human world and the divine, which is what the pharaoh has always done, which is what the pharaoh exists to do. Whether she truly believed herself to be the goddess incarnate, or whether this was sophisticated political theater, or whether, as is perhaps most likely, the distinction between belief and political performance was less clear in the ancient world than it is in ours, is a question that cannot be answered from this distance. What can be said is that she played the role with commitment and consistency, and that this commitment was recognized and appreciated by the Egyptian population and especially by the Egyptian priesthood in ways that had very real political consequences. Now, some things about her mother need to be said because they matter for understanding who Cleopatra was and how she thought of herself. The identity of Cleopatra's mother is not established in any surviving ancient source with certainty. This is a striking gap in the historical record, and it is not accidental. The ancient sources that survive were written mostly by Romans or by people working in the Greek and Roman tradition, and they often did not consider the identity of royal mothers to be important enough to record precisely. What we know about Ptolemy Xi's official wife and co-ruler is that she was named Cleopatra v. Tryphonina, a common Ptolemaic dynastic name, and that she disappears from the historical record around 69 BCE, the approximate time of Cleopatra VI's birth. Whether she died in childbirth, was politically removed, or simply fades from the record for other reasons, cannot be determined. Some scholars have proposed that Cleopatra's mother may not have been Ptolemy Xi's official wife at all, but rather a secondary consort or concubine. And some scholars have gone further, suggesting on the basis of circumstantial evidence, Cleopatra's unusual affinity for Egyptian culture, her commitment to the Egyptian language and religion, her identification with the Egyptian divine tradition in ways that go beyond what political calculation alone would require, that her mother may have had Egyptian ancestry. This is possible but not proven. The historical evidence is insufficient to settle the question. The most widely accepted scholarly view, based on what we know of Ptolemaic dynastic practice, is that Cleopatra was primarily of Macedonian Greek descent. But the uncertainty should be acknowledged rather than papered over. What can be said with confidence is this: whatever her heritage, Cleopatra's identity was Egyptian. She ruled as an Egyptian queen, in the Egyptian tradition, serving as the embodiment of an Egyptian goddess. She spoke the Egyptian language. She performed the Egyptian rituals. She built and restored Egyptian temples. She was understood by the Egyptian population and the Egyptian priesthood as their pharaoh in the fullest and most traditional sense of that word. And perhaps that is the most important thing to say. Because in the ancient world, as in many ways today, identity was not simply a matter of blood. It was also a matter of choice, of commitment, of what you devoted yourself to, of what you were willing to learn and to become. Cleopatra made her choices clearly and consistently throughout her reign, and those choices pointed in one direction: Egypt. She had a sister whose story is worth knowing, because it runs alongside Cleopatra's own story in a way that illuminates both. Arsinoe was Cleopatra's younger sister, born perhaps 3 or 4 years after her. Like Cleopatra, she was a Ptolemaic princess, educated in the same palace, shaped by the same environment. Like Cleopatra, she was intelligent and capable. And like Cleopatra, she understood that survival in the Ptolemaic court required not passivity but active engagement, not waiting for the world to arrange itself around you but moving to arrange it yourself. The two sisters do not appear to have been close. The fragmentary ancient sources suggest that their relationship was competitive, as Ptolemaic sibling relationships tended to be, given that any surviving royal sibling represented a potential rival claim to the throne. But competition does not preclude a kind of complicated mutual recognition, and there is something in the parallel arcs of their stories that is worth following. Arsinoe would play a significant role in the early years of Cleopatra's reign, and then in Cleopatra's relationship with Julius Caesar, and then she would disappear from the story in a way that leaves a certain shadow over what came after. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, let us return to the beginning of Cleopatra's reign, which began in the spring of 51 BCE with the death of her father. Ptolemy XII Auletes died in March or April of 51 BCE. He had been ill for some time. The ancient sources are vague about the nature of his illness, and his decline had been visible at court for at least a year before his death. He was perhaps 50 years old, possibly a little older. He had been king of Egypt, with interruption, since approximately 80 BCE, a long reign by any standard and a difficult one. His will, deposited with the Roman Senate in a gesture that speaks volumes about the political reality of his situation, specified that his eldest daughter Cleopatra and his eldest surviving son, a boy named Ptolemy, who would become Ptolemy XIII, were to reign jointly as co-rulers of Egypt, and that Rome was to be the guarantor of this arrangement. The deposit of the will with Rome was not a courtesy or a formality. It was an acknowledgement of political reality. The Roman Senate was, in practical terms, the arbiter of legitimacy in the Eastern Mediterranean. A ruler whose claim was recognized by Rome had a degree of political protection that a ruler without Roman recognition lacked. Ptolemy XII was ensuring, even from beyond the grave, that his children's inheritance would be backed by the authority of the most powerful state in the world. But the arrangement he left behind was inherently unstable, and he surely knew this. Cleopatra was 18 years old, an adult by ancient standards, a woman of substantial education and political experience, already deeply engaged in the governance of the kingdom. Her brother Ptolemy XIII was perhaps 9 or 10 years old, a child entirely dependent on the adults around him. In a functioning joint reign, the adult sibling would naturally dominate. The child would be nominal, a face on the coins and a name on the decrees, while the actual work of governance was done by the capable adult. But the adults around the child had their own interests to protect. And a child king who grew into an adult king, or more precisely a child king managed by ambitious advisors who preferred their influence to remain unchallenged, was not going to simply defer to his capable sister forever. The court of Ptolemy XIII was controlled by 3 men whose names become, in the ancient sources, almost synonymous with treachery and bad judgment. There was Pothinus, who served as the young king's regent, a eunuch, the ancient sources tell us, which in the Ptolemaic court was not unusual for positions of intimate royal service. He was intelligent and ruthlessly self-interested, and he appears to have understood very early that his power depended on the young king remaining pliable and on the queen remaining marginal. There was Achilles, who commanded the Egyptian army, or at least the portion of it stationed in Alexandria. And there was Theodotus of Chios, who served as the young king's tutor and reader, his teacher in the art of public speaking and political argument. These 3 men formed an informal council around the boy king, and their agenda was clear: keep Cleopatra away from power, or better yet, remove her entirely. For approximately the first 2 years of the joint reign, Cleopatra managed to govern despite their opposition. She was clearly the dominant figure. Her name appears first on official documents, she is depicted alone in certain temple inscriptions. There are papyrus documents from this period that show her actively managing administrative matters. She was working hard, consolidating relationships with the Egyptian priesthood, managing the economic crisis her father had left behind, navigating the complex Roman question that was never entirely away from the center of Egyptian political calculation. But the opposition around her brother was working harder. In 49 BCE, the exact circumstances are not preserved in detail in any surviving source. They moved against her. Cleopatra was expelled from Alexandria. She was 20 years old. She had been queen for less than 2 years. She had been expelled from her own palace, from her own city, from the country she had been born to rule, by the advisors of a 10-year-old boy. She went east. She fled into the eastern desert, toward the Sinai, toward the border. And she did not collapse. She did not surrender. She did not spend her exile waiting in despair for circumstances to change. She was, from the beginning, working. The ancient sources are frustratingly incomplete about what exactly she was doing in those months between her expulsion from Alexandria and the arrival of the event that would transform everything. But the general picture that emerges is of a woman who was actively building. She was recruiting soldiers, mercenaries from the eastern Mediterranean, from the peoples of the Sinai and the Negev and the Syrian coast, fighters who were willing to serve a displaced queen if the price was right and if the queen seemed capable of making good on her promises. She was also watching. She had excellent intelligence about what was happening in Alexandria and what was happening in Rome. She understood the larger political situation with a clarity that is almost painful to contemplate in retrospect. She knew that the Roman Civil War was beginning. She knew that Caesar and Pompey were moving toward a final confrontation. She knew that whichever side won, the eastern Mediterranean would be reshaped, and that Egypt would be in the middle of whatever happened next. She was 20 years old, in exile in the eastern desert, assembling a mercenary army and waiting for the right moment. She was already thinking several moves ahead. The right moment arrived, as it so often does in history, in the form of someone else's catastrophe. Pompey's catastrophe specifically. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great as his admirers called him, was one of the most celebrated military commanders in Roman history. He had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates. He had conquered Pontus and Syria and much of the eastern Mediterranean for Rome. He had been 3 times consul, the highest elected office in the Republic. He had organized the settlement of Rome's eastern conquests with a thoroughness and an intelligence that demonstrated genuine administrative talent. But in the summer of 48 BCE he lost. The Battle of Pharsalus, in Thessaly in central Greece, on the 9th of August in 48 BCE, was the decisive engagement of the Roman Civil War. Caesar's army, smaller but better positioned and better led, broke Pompey's forces in a matter of hours. Pompey fled the battlefield. With him went his hopes, and with his hopes went the Republic's last serious chance of resisting what Caesar was becoming. Pompey fled east. He had supporters in the east, client kings and rulers he had patronized over the years, people who owed him favors, people who had benefited from his governance of the Roman eastern provinces. He thought perhaps that he could regroup, rebuild, try again. He thought Egypt might support him. He had been a patron of Ptolemy XII after all. He had supported the old king's restoration. He had a relationship with Egypt. He was wrong. As Pompey's ship approached the shore at Pelusium, the ancient fortress city on the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, which happened to be very close to the place where Cleopatra had assembled her forces, a small boat was rowed out to meet him. In it were several men, a former Roman soldier named Septimius who had served with Pompey's legions in the past, a man who Pompey presumably recognized and perhaps felt reassured to see. And with Septimius was Achillas, the military commander of Ptolemy Xi's court. They invited Pompey to step from his ship into their small boat to come ashore. His wife Cornelia, watching from the deck of the ship, felt uneasy. Something was wrong, she thought, something in the manner of the men, in the silence, in the quality of the invitation. She tried to dissuade him. He went anyway. He was stabbed to death before the boat reached the shore. The 3 advisors of Ptolemy XIII, Pothinus, Achillas and Theodotus, had debated the decision. The debate itself is recorded by the ancient historians, though whether the specific arguments are accurately preserved or have been reconstructed is uncertain. The argument that prevailed was this: Rome would be grateful for the death of its enemy. Caesar would arrive, and Caesar would find that Egypt had already dealt with his problem. It would be an offering, a demonstration of loyalty to the winning side. It was a catastrophic error in judgment. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria a few days after Pompey's death, he was met by Theodotus, who presented him with Pompey's severed head and his signet ring as proofs of the deed. Caesar looked at the head of the man who had been his rival, his enemy, the man who had controlled the Roman state against him, and he turned away and wept. He wept. This response baffled the Egyptians who had engineered the murder, and it has puzzled some historians since. But it is not, on reflection, difficult to understand. Pompey was a Roman consul. He had been the most powerful man in Rome for decades. He had been Caesar's father-in-law once. Caesar's daughter Julia had been Pompey's wife, and she had died in childbirth a few years before the Civil War, and there had been genuine affection between the 2 men before politics tore them apart. And more than any of these personal connections, Pompey's murder meant that Caesar had been denied the thing he wanted most, which was the ability to exercise clemency. Caesar's famous clemency, his willingness to pardon defeated enemies, to demonstrate mercy rather than vengeance, was not merely a moral position but a political strategy. A pardoned enemy became a grateful client. A killed enemy became a martyr with grieving allies. Caesar wanted to win the civil war, yes. But he wanted to win it in a way that left him with the moral authority of the merciful victor. The Egyptians had taken that from him. They had murdered his enemy on foreign soil, without his authorization, without his consent, in a way that was both presumptuous and deeply offensive to Roman ideas of dignity. Caesar was angry. He was in Alexandria with perhaps 4,000 soldiers, a small force in a city of hundreds of thousands. He was surrounded by a potentially hostile population, dependent on a harbor controlled by an Egyptian fleet of significant size. He was angry and he was in a complicated situation, and he needed to assert control of that situation quickly. It was into this delicate, charged, dangerous moment that Cleopatra chose to insert herself. The story of her arrival in Caesar's chambers is among the most famous scenes in ancient history. Like so many famous ancient scenes, it sits at the intersection of genuine historical record and the inevitable embellishments of storytelling across time. The principal ancient source for this account is Plutarch, writing in his Life of Caesar and his Life of Antony, perhaps a century and a half after the events, drawing on earlier sources whose reliability varied. What Plutarch says: Cleopatra had herself carried to Caesar concealed inside something. The Greek word he uses, stroma, has been translated variously as a sack, a roll of bedding, a length of linen, a carpet. The famous Cleopatra rolled in a carpet story derives from this passage, though carpet is probably not the right translation. The Egyptian equivalent would have been a woven mat or a roll of heavy linen. The precise object matters less than what it represents. She was in exile. The palace was controlled by her brother's forces. The city gates and the palace entrances were watched by people loyal to the Ptolemy 13 faction, people who had every reason to prevent Cleopatra from reaching Caesar before they could present their own version of events. If she appeared openly at the palace gate, she would be stopped or worse. She needed to be in Caesar's presence before anyone knew she was there. So she had herself concealed in a piece of bedding or linen, carried by a single companion, probably a Sicilian merchant named Apollodorus, who is mentioned by name in the ancient sources, rowed across the harbor in a small boat in the darkness, carried through some entrance into the palace and brought before Caesar. She emerged from her covering into the lamplight of a Roman general's chamber. It is a scene that invites the imagination, and the imagination has been applied to it for 2,000 years. Every version of Cleopatra's story feels compelled to dwell here. The dramatic reveal, the young queen rising from concealment into the presence of the most powerful man in the world. But strip away the drama and what you have is something even more interesting than drama. What you have is a precise exercise of political intelligence. Consider what she knew and what she needed to do. She knew that Caesar was angry. She knew that he was in an uncomfortable political and military position. Relatively small force, hostile city, complicated diplomatic situation. She knew that her brother's advisors had already presented their version of events to Caesar and were working hard to frame the dispute between the siblings in a way that was favorable to them. She knew that if she went through normal channels, if she sent a letter, if she asked for an appointment through intermediaries, if she approached the situation through the formal diplomatic machinery, she would be playing on ground that her enemies controlled. They controlled the palace. They controlled access to Caesar. They would intercept her communications, delay her meeting, use every day she waited to further consolidate their narrative. She needed to be in the room. Not eventually. No. So she got herself into the room in the most direct and audacious way available to her. She physically transported herself there, concealed in something innocuous enough to pass through whatever security existed, and she appeared before Caesar as a fact rather than as a request. She was 21 years old. The conversation that followed lasted, according to ancient accounts, for much of the night. And by the time morning came, Caesar had made his decision. He would arbitrate the dispute between the royal siblings, in accordance with their father's will and in accordance with the wishes of the Roman Senate, which had been the designated guarantor of the Ptolemaic succession. He summoned both Cleopatra and Ptolemy 13 to appear before him. Ptolemy 13 arrived to find his sister already installed in the palace. The boy king, we are told, was furious. He ran out into the streets of Alexandria tearing the royal diadem from his head, crying out to the Alexandrian crowd that he had been betrayed. It was a dramatic gesture, perhaps coached by Pothinus, and it worked to some degree. The crowd was angry, there were demonstrations, there was genuine unrest. But it no longer mattered in the way it had before. The parameters of the situation had shifted entirely. Caesar was in the palace and so was Cleopatra, and what happened next would happen on terms that she had helped to define. This is worth sitting with for a moment. In less than 24 hours, in the space of a single night spent in conversation with one of the most formidable men in the ancient world, Cleopatra had gone from exiled pretender to installed co-ruler, from the outside of the palace to the center of it. She had not done this with an army. She had not done this with a great sum of money. She had done it with presence, with intelligence, with the willingness to take an audacious physical risk, and with whatever it was she possessed that made Caesar, a man of extraordinary experience and sophistication, decide within a single night that she was worth supporting. What was it? This is the question that hangs over every account of Cleopatra, and it is worth spending some time with it because the usual answer, her beauty, her sensuality, her physical desirability, is almost certainly wrong, or at least incomplete to the point of being misleading. Plutarch, who is our most detailed ancient source on Cleopatra's personality, writes something that is both famous and consistently underemphasized. He writes that her beauty was not, in itself, so remarkable as to be incomparable or to strike the beholder speechless, and that it was not her physical appearance that first captivated those who met her. Rather, it was her conversation. It was her character. It was the quality of her presence when she was talking to you, the extraordinary combination of warmth and intelligence and attentiveness that made the person she was speaking with feel, somehow, that they were the most interesting person in the world and also that they were in the presence of someone genuinely formidable. Plutarch says that her voice was extraordinarily beautiful, that it could move between languages with ease and that the quality of it, the range and the warmth of it, was like a many-stringed instrument. He says that she was never at a loss, that in any language in any context she could find the precise register, the precise tone, the precise argument for the situation. And he says something even more striking, that she was the kind of person who, when she turned her full attention on you, made you feel seen in a way that was almost overwhelming. Not seduced in the simple physical sense. See, understood, recognized. This is a description of extraordinary emotional and intellectual intelligence. It is a description of someone who had studied human beings, their needs, their desires, their fears, their vanities, their blind spots, with the same systematic thoroughness with which she had studied languages and mathematics and astronomy, who had learned to read people the way she had learned to read scrolls. Caesar was 52 years old. He had met kings and queens and generals and philosophers and barbarian chiefs and Roman senators and slave traders and every variety of human being that the ancient world could produce. He was not a man who was easily dazzled or easily manipulated. He had survived the rough school of Roman politics, which was as intellectually and politically demanding as anything the ancient world offered. And this 21-year-old queen, arriving in his chamber concealed in a roll of linen, held his attention for an entire night and emerged from the conversation with an alliance. She did not do this with her body. She did it with her mind. The weeks that followed Cleopatra's arrival in Caesar's chambers were tense and dangerous. Caesar had declared his intention to arbitrate the dispute between the co-rulers, but the advisors of Ptolemy XIII were not interested in arbitration that would restore Cleopatra's position. They began maneuvering. Pothinus opened communications with Achillas and the Egyptian army. The army began to move toward Alexandria. Caesar had Pothinus arrested and later executed when he discovered evidence of the general's communications with Achillas. But the army was already on the move, and within days Alexandria was effectively besieged. Caesar, with his small force, controlled only the palace quarter and the harbor area. The rest of the city, and the enormously larger Egyptian army surrounding it, was in the hands of his enemies. There was also the complication of Arsinoe. Cleopatra's younger sister, who had been living in the palace and watching events unfold, made a decision. She slipped out of the palace, joined the Egyptian army besieging it, and was proclaimed queen by Achillas. She was, by some estimates, perhaps 15 or 16 years old at the time. The sources suggest this was partly her own initiative and partly the result of manipulation by her tutor and advisor, a eunuch named Ganymedes. But whatever the precise balance of agency and manipulation, the result was clear. There were now two Ptolemaic queens claiming the Egyptian throne, and they were on opposite sides of the siege. For Caesar, Arsinoe's presence with the besieging army was a complication. It gave the anti-Caesar forces a legitimate royal figurehead. For Cleopatra it was something more personal. Her sister had chosen to fight against her. Their relationship, which was probably never warm, was now openly adversarial. The Alexandrian War, as the ancient sources call it, lasted several months. It was a confined, urban conflict, street fighting in one of the world's most densely populated cities, naval engagements in the harbor, sorties and counter-sorties, a grinding siege that tested everyone involved. There was the famous episode of the fire in the harbor. Caesar, facing the threat that the large Egyptian fleet would be used against him, set fire to some of the ships. The fire spread. Fires in ancient port cities, with their wooden structures and their oil warehouses and their accumulated flammable material, always spread, and the ancient sources claimed it reached and destroyed the Library of Alexandria. This claim has been repeated so often that it has become part of the standard narrative of Cleopatra's story, but modern scholarship is skeptical. The library, at the time Caesar was fighting in Alexandria, was certainly still functioning. It was still functioning decades after the Alexandrian War. The great scholarly tradition of Alexandria continued for generations after Caesar's fire. What the fire most likely destroyed was a warehouse near the harbor that contained scrolls awaiting shipment, a significant loss but not the library itself. The library's eventual decline was a slower and more complicated process that extended over centuries and had multiple causes, none of them as clean or as dramatic as a single fire. Caesar was reinforced in early 47 BCE. An army arrived from the east, crossing the Sinai, the ancient invasion route into Egypt, and marching through the Nile Delta. This force, led by Mithridates of Pergamon, included a contingent of Jewish troops provided by Antipater of Idumea, the same Antipater whose son would later become Herod the Great. With this reinforcement, Caesar was no longer pinned in the palace quarter. He could move, and he moved decisively. The decisive battle was fought near the Nile. Ptolemy XIII, the boy king, was present with the Egyptian forces. After the Egyptian defeat, he attempted to flee across the Nile and was apparently drowned. His body, identified by the golden armor he was wearing, was supposedly recovered from the river later. He was perhaps 13 or 14 years old. The war was over. Caesar had won. And Cleopatra was queen. Not queen alone, not immediately. Ptolemaic tradition required a male co-ruler, and with Ptolemy XIII dead, the role fell to a younger brother, another boy named Ptolemy who became Ptolemy XIV. He was perhaps 10 or 11 years old. Cleopatra's marriage to him was purely ceremonial, purely political, a concession to Ptolemaic tradition and to the expectations of the Egyptian priesthood. There was no personal dimension to it whatsoever. She was 21. He was a child. She governed, he was a face on the coins. The governance she exercised was real and substantial. Caesar stayed in Egypt far longer than his military and political situation strictly required. He should have left relatively quickly after the defeat of the Egyptian forces. Because Rome needed him, the civil war was not entirely resolved. There were enemies and challenges elsewhere. Instead, he stayed in Alexandria for several months, and during this stay he and Cleopatra began what the ancient sources describe as a relationship of genuine depth and mutual engagement. The political and personal dimensions of this relationship are impossible to fully disentangle from this distance. They were both, manifestly, pragmatic people with clear political agendas who understood what they needed from each other. But they were also, by the ancient accounts, genuinely interesting to each other, people who found in the other something that most people they encountered could not provide: an equal. Caesar was one of the most intellectually impressive men of his age, not just a great general and a great politician but a genuine writer, an observer of human nature, a man of sophisticated intellectual curiosity. Cleopatra was, by any measure, one of the most intellectually accomplished women of her age or any age. When they talked, they would have had genuinely interesting things to say to each other. There is a story from this period that is preserved in the ancient sources that speaks, I think, to the quality of their time together. Caesar and Cleopatra went together on a journey up the Nile, a long, slow river journey deep into Egypt, to see the ancient monuments and the ancient temples and the ancient civilization that Cleopatra was queen of and that Caesar was now, in some sense, the military protector of. Think about what that journey must have been like. Two highly intelligent people moving slowly south through the Egyptian landscape, past the papyrus marshes and the date palm forests and the great agricultural fields on either side of the river, past villages where people who had never seen a Roman general stood and stared, past temples whose construction had begun before Rome was a city, before Greece was a civilization, before the Macedonian kingdom that produced Alexander the Great existed in any recognizable form. Two people, one from the oldest civilization in the world and one from the city that was in the process of conquering the world, moving through ancient landscape together, talking. Caesar, who had been everywhere and seen almost everything the ancient world had to offer, had never been to Egypt before. Cleopatra, who had grown up in Alexandria and understood Egypt intellectually and culturally, was now experiencing the ancient south of her kingdom in the company of someone who was seeing it for the first time. She was showing him her country. He was encountering, for the first time, the sheer weight of time that Egypt represented. The temples built before his own civilization existed, the gods worshipped before his own pantheon had names, the accumulated 3,000 years of a civilization that had done things and understood things that Rome was still only beginning to think about. It must have been extraordinary. Think of standing at the base of the Great Pyramid at Giza, that structure which was already 2,500 years old when Cleopatra was born. Think of standing in the temple complex at Karnak, in the forest of enormous columns painted with images of gods and pharaohs that stretched back to before the foundation of Rome. Think of the Valley of the Kings, where generations of pharaohs had been buried in tombs cut into the limestone cliffs, surrounded by everything they would need in the afterlife: food and clothing and furniture and small figures of servants made of blue faience, and texts on the walls that told the story of the journey through the underworld and back to the light. Caesar saw all of this, and perhaps for the first time in his life, This man who had conquered Gaul and crossed the Rubicon and changed the Roman world, this man who was not easily impressed, he was genuinely, quietly awed. Because 3,000 years is a length of time that is difficult to comprehend from the perspective of a civilization that was, at that point, perhaps 700 or 800 years old. Rome was young in the scale of things. Rome was an experiment still in progress. Egypt was something else entirely, a proof that it was possible for a human civilization to persist, to accumulate, to deepen its understanding of the world across spans of time that made Roman history look brief. He saw this, and he saw the woman beside him who was the living heir of all of it. The woman who could read the inscriptions on the temple walls. The woman who knew the names of the gods represented in the painted reliefs, who could tell him the stories those images encoded, who carried in her education and her identity the living continuity of 3,000 years. Whatever he felt about her, whatever complex mixture of political calculation and personal connection had developed between them during those first strange nights in the palace at Alexandria, in those weeks on the Nile, moving slowly south through the oldest landscape in the world, something deepened. When Caesar finally left Egypt, in the spring or summer of 47 BCE, Cleopatra was pregnant. Their son was born in June of that year, while Caesar was still in Egypt or shortly after his departure. The timing is uncertain. Cleopatra named him Ptolemy Caesar, giving him both his dynastic and his paternal names. The Alexandrians called him Caesaron, Little Caesar. He was a Ptolemaic heir and a Roman general's son simultaneously. He was, potentially, the most important child in the world, the legitimate heir of the oldest monarchy in the Mediterranean and the biological son of the man who was in the process of remaking the Roman state. He would live for 17 years. He would become the central figure around whom the final act of Cleopatra's story would turn. And he would die because of who he was. The years between Caesar's departure from Egypt in 47 BCE and his assassination in March of 44 BCE were years of relatively quiet administration for Cleopatra. They are not well documented. The ancient sources tend to track the famous Romans, and in the absence of a famous Roman in Alexandria, Cleopatra's activities receive less attention than they deserve. But what we can reconstruct suggests a ruler who was fully engaged in the business of governance. The economy of Egypt was in difficult condition when she came to power. Her father had borrowed enormous sums to finance his return from exile, and those debts had to be serviced. The agricultural system, which was the foundation of everything, required constant attention. The irrigation canals maintained, the flood management coordinated, the grain storage organized, the tax collection administered with enough consistency to generate revenue without crushing the population that generated it. There are surviving papyrus documents from Cleopatra's reign, actual physical documents, preserved by the dry climate of Egypt, that show her engaging with the details of governance at a surprisingly granular level. There is a papyrus from 33 BCE, perhaps a dozen years before her death, in which a decision has been made to grant tax exemptions to a Roman merchant, and on which a single word appears in Cleopatra's own hand, genestoi, let it be so. One word, in her handwriting, on a document dealing with the practical details of trade administration. It is the smallest possible trace of the queen at work, and yet it is somehow deeply moving, the tangible evidence that behind all the mythology and the propaganda and the subsequent centuries of reinterpretation, there was a real woman making real decisions about real things. She managed the religious landscape of Egypt with skill and consistency. The temples continued to receive their royal patronage. New buildings were constructed and old ones maintained. The relationship with the Egyptian priesthood was carefully tended. At Dendera, at Edfu, at Philae, at Calabsha, the great temple complexes of the Nile Valley, reliefs and inscriptions record Cleopatra as pharaoh in the full ancient sense, performing the ritual duties that the Egyptian conception of sacred kingship required. She was also maintaining relationships with the complex network of client kingdoms and city-states that surrounded Egypt, Judea under the early stages of Herodian development, the Nabatean kingdom of Arabia, the various cities and powers of the eastern Mediterranean coastline. Egypt's strategic position as a wealthy, grain-producing kingdom at the intersection of the African, Asian, and European worlds meant that Cleopatra was always operating in a web of relationships and obligations and opportunities that extended far beyond her own borders. There is something worth saying about what it meant to govern Egypt in the ancient world, because it is easy to think of it purely in terms of the dramatic events, the wars, the Roman alliances, the propaganda battles, and to lose sight of the quieter reality underneath. Egypt was, in many ways, the most manageable large kingdom in the ancient world, precisely because of the Nile. The river organized everything. The cycle of flood and recession and planting and harvest was not merely a metaphor for Egyptian civilization, It was the literal mechanism by which Egyptian civilization operated. The flood brought the silt that fertilized the fields. The recession revealed the planting surface. The harvest provided the grain that fed the population. The state collected a portion of that grain as taxes, stored it in the enormous granary system and redistributed it as needed, as payment for labor, as support for the priesthood and the military, as emergency reserve in years when the flood was too low or too high. Managing this system required, above all, regularity and predictability. The farmers needed to know that their obligations would be consistent, that the tax collectors would not demand more than had been established, that the irrigation canals they depended on would be maintained by the state. The priests needed to know that the temple estates would be respected and that the ritual calendar would be honored. The merchants needed to know that the commercial regulations would be enforced consistently and that contracts would be upheld. Cleopatra provided these things. The documentary evidence from her reign, fragmentary as it is, shows a consistent pattern of administrative attention. The papyrus documents show not just the one famous instance of her handwriting but a broader picture of a functioning bureaucratic system operating under royal supervision. In 46 BCE she made the journey to Rome. She went as Caesar's ally and as the mother of his son. She was installed, with Caesarion and her household, in Caesar's villa across the Tiber, the magnificent gardens on the western bank of the river where Caesar retreated from the noise and pressure of the city. She was there as a guest, as a visiting head of state, not as a prisoner or a supplicant. She had an audience with the Roman Senate. She met the intellectuals and artists of Rome's extraordinarily vibrant cultural scene. And she met Cicero. Marcus Tullius Cicero, orator, philosopher, lawyer, senator, the most eloquent man of his age, was not impressed. He writes about her in his letters to his friend Atticus with a kind of acid dismissiveness that tells us rather more about Cicero than about Cleopatra. He found her arrogant, he says. She took insufficient account of his dignity. She made promises to him that she subsequently failed to keep, though what these promises involved is not entirely clear from his account. What is clear is this: Cleopatra did not feel the need to perform deference to powerful Romans simply because they were Roman and powerful. She was a queen. She was the ruler of an ancient and wealthy kingdom. She behaved accordingly. And this, to Cicero, who was accustomed to being treated as one of the great men of the age, was offensive. Good for her. She was observing Rome carefully during those months in the villa across the Tiber. She was watching how power worked in this city that was in the process of remaking itself. She was watching Caesar, watching him accept honors that no Roman before him had accepted, watching him have his face put on coins while he was still alive, watching him appointed dictator perpetuo, dictator for life, watching the republican institutions that had governed Rome for 500 years gradually accommodate themselves to the reality of one man's dominance. She was watching history turn. She was watching the world she had been born in to transform into something new and unprecedented. And she was calculating her position within whatever came next. Caesar was killed on the Ides of March 44 BCE. The news arrived at the villa across the Tiber. Perhaps it arrived in the form of a servant running, breathless, with a message. Perhaps it arrived in the form of distant noise from the city, the sound of something happening that was too large and too sudden to be ordinary. Perhaps it arrived more quietly, a visitor at the door with a face that made words unnecessary. 23 stab wounds. The theater of Pompey. A group of senators calling themselves liberators. The greatest man of the age dead on a marble floor. We don't know what Cleopatra felt. This is one of the places in her story where the absence of her own words, her own recorded voice, becomes most painful. The ancient sources are almost entirely silent about her reaction. They rarely recorded the inner lives of women, even queens, even women whose lives intersected with the greatest events of their age. They recorded what men did and what men said and what men felt, and women appeared in those records primarily in relation to the men, as wives or mothers or lovers or rivals. But we can reason from what followed. She left Rome very quickly. Within days, possibly within hours. She took Caesarion and her household and departed. She had no choice. Her protector was dead. The political situation was uncertain and rapidly evolving and potentially very dangerous for a foreign queen with a political connection to the deceased man at the center of everything. She needed to be in Egypt, on her throne, managing her kingdom from a position of stability rather than waiting in Rome as a potentially useful hostage for whichever faction emerged dominant. She was 25 years old. She had been ruling Egypt for 6 years. She had survived exile and civil war and the Alexandrian War and the complex negotiations of the Roman alliance. And she was about to navigate the most turbulent period in Roman history since the fall of the Old Republic. Back in Alexandria, she acted quickly. Her young co-ruler brother, Ptolemy XIV, died shortly after her return. The ancient sources are not specific about when or precisely how, and there has been scholarly debate about whether Cleopatra had him killed. The political logic for doing so was clear. Caesarion was now 3 years old enough to serve as the nominal co-ruler, and a young Caesarion was infinitely preferable to a growing Ptolemy who would eventually become a male adult with his own claims and his own potential for being used by factions within the court. Whether she ordered the death or whether the boy died of natural causes, childhood mortality in the ancient world was devastating, and he was perhaps 12 or 13, cannot be established from surviving evidence. What is clear is that after his death she was effectively sole ruler, with the child Caesarion as her designated heir and ceremonial co-ruler. The dynasty was simplified. The succession was clear. And Cleopatra turned her full attention to the political situation that was developing in Rome with the speed and violence of a Mediterranean storm. The years between Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE and the arrival of Mark Antony in Cleopatra's story in 41 BCE were years of extraordinary turbulence in the Roman world, and Cleopatra navigated them with the skill of someone who had learned, watching her father, that survival required constant attention to where the center of gravity was shifting. Caesar's assassination had not restored the Republic. It had simply removed Caesar while leaving in place all the conditions that had produced him: the social dislocations, the military culture, the concentration of power in the hands of ambitious men with devoted armies. Within months of Caesar's death, the same dynamics that had produced the civil war between Caesar and Pompey were reproducing themselves in the conflict between Antony and Octavian on one side and the assassins Brutus and Cassius on the other. The second triumvirate, the formal alliance between Mark Antony, Octavian and a third man named Lepidus, was formed in October of 43 BCE. It was a brutally efficient political instrument. Its first order of business was the proscription of its enemies, the publication of lists of names of people who could be killed by anyone who found them, with rewards for the killers and the confiscation of the victim's property. Hundreds of names went on those lists. Thousands of people died. Among them was Cicero. The great orator, the man who had written some of the most beautiful Latin prose ever composed, the man who had defended the Republic with his voice for decades, was caught on a country road while attempting to flee Italy. His killers cut off his head and his hands. His head and hands were displayed on the rostra in the Roman Forum, the place where he had so often stood to speak. Mark Antony's wife Fulvia is said to have taken a pin from her hair and driven it through the dead tongue that had spoken so eloquently against her husband. Brutus and Cassius were defeated at the twin battles of Philippi in October and November of 42 BCE. Both men died, the ancient sources say by their own hands, following the tradition of suicide that Roman aristocrats preferred to capture and the humiliation of a triumph. The Republic, such as it was over. Antony and Octavian divided the Roman world between them. Octavian took the west, Italy and Gaul and Spain and the western provinces. Antony took the east, Greece and Asia Minor and Syria and the responsibility for managing Rome's complex relationships with the kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean. This division brought Antony into Egypt's orbit. Mark Antony in 41 BCE was 42 years old. He was one of the most physically impressive men of his age. Large, athletic, with the kind of presence that commands attention in any room, the kind of face that ancient artists associated with Hercules, with whom he liked to identify himself. He was a genuinely capable general, brave in battle, tactically intelligent, beloved by his soldiers with a devotion that went beyond the ordinary professional loyalty of Roman armies. He was also, by the standards of Roman aristocracy, somewhat undisciplined, fond of wine and women and the pleasures of the table in ways that his more calculating colleagues found strategically unwise. He was generous to a fault, generous with money, generous with time, generous with affection, and this generosity was both his greatest virtue and one of his most significant political vulnerabilities. He summoned Cleopatra to meet him at Tarsus, a city in the southeastern corner of what is now Turkey. The summons was framed as a demand for an accounting. Cleopatra was alleged to have provided some degree of support to Cassius, one of Caesar's assassins, during the recent conflict, and Antony wanted her to explain herself. It was a power move. It was Antony establishing that Cleopatra was accountable to Roman authority, that Egypt was in the Roman sphere and its queen could be summoned to explain herself to a Roman triumvir. Cleopatra's response demonstrated, immediately and decisively, that she had no intention of accepting that framing. She did not go immediately. She let Antony's messengers come and go. She let him wait. She let him send additional messengers with more urgent language. She let him understand, in the way that only a sustained and deliberate delay can communicate, that she would come when she was ready and in the manner she chose. And when she came in a way that the city of Tarsus and the Roman general waiting in it would never forget. The ancient account of Cleopatra's arrival at Tarsus is one of the most famous descriptive passages in all of ancient literature. Plutarch preserves it in his Life of Antony, drawing on an earlier account by a man named Dellius who was actually present at the scene. It is the passage that Shakespeare took almost word for word and gave to the character of Enobarbus in his play Antony and Cleopatra, and Shakespeare's version, "The barge she sat in, like a burnished throne, burned on the water," has become so embedded in the cultural memory that it is difficult to read the original without hearing the echo of the later version. She sailed up the river Cydnus toward Tarsus on a barge of extraordinary magnificence. The stern, the rear of the vessel, was gilded with gold, shining in the afternoon sun. The sails were purple, that deep, oceanic purple made from the murex shellfish, the color that throughout the ancient world was the exclusive reserve of royalty and divine authority, the color that was literally more expensive by weight than gold, the color that said, without any possibility of misinterpretation, "This is what power looks like." The oars were silver, and they moved through the water in perfect time to music, the music of flutes and pipes and stringed instruments played by musicians stationed on the deck. She reclined beneath a canopy woven of gold cloth, dressed and presented as the goddess Aphrodite, or, in the Egyptian theological framework that she understood better than any Greek parallel, as Isis, the queen of heaven, coming to meet Dionysus, the god of wine and transformation and the East, who was the divine identity that Antony claimed for himself. This parallel, Isis meeting Dionysus, the divine queen of Egypt meeting the divine master of the Greek world, was not accidental and would not have been lost on anyone in the ancient world who saw it or heard it described. Young boys dressed as Cupids stood on either side of her, fanning her with large fans made of peacock feathers. Her serving women were dressed as sea nymphs and graces, some at the rudder and ropes, some bringing garlands of flowers. The perfumes of the incense and the flowers drifted from the barge across the water to the bank before the barge itself arrived. And the people of Tarsus ran to see it. They ran from the markets and the workshops and the houses and the public spaces. They ran from everywhere, and as they ran toward the river to see this extraordinary sight, Antony's official reception, the public forum he had arranged, the tribunal where he sat to receive supplicants and allies, emptied completely. The entire city had abandoned him for the queen arriving on the river. Antony sat alone on his tribunal. Cleopatra sent him an invitation to dinner. He accepted. She did not go to him. He went to her. In one afternoon's theatrical event, Cleopatra had entirely reframed the power dynamic of their meeting. She had been summoned. She had declined to be summoned and had instead arrived on her own terms. She had been expected to explain herself to a Roman triumvir. Instead, she had emptied his forum and received him as a guest on her barge. Every element of her entrance was a message. The purple sails, "I am a queen and queens do not come to Romans as petitioners, they come as peers." The goddess imagery, "I am not merely a political figure, I am a sacred force, and you are meeting me in the context of divine equality, not Roman hierarchy." The delay, the magnificence, the perfume drifting across the water, "I set the terms. I arrive when and how I choose." And the invitation to dinner, with its implicit reversal, the summoner now being invited to come, the powerful one now being received, completed the reframing. Antony was not a man who was easily outmaneuvered. He had spent his life in the rough school of Roman political and military competition, where every advantage was pressed and every weakness exploited. But he recognized, as anyone with genuine intelligence must have recognized, that he had just encountered something remarkable. He went to the dinner. The dinner that first night was, by all accounts, extraordinary. The rooms in which it was held were lit with an arrangement of lights that the ancient sources describe with unusual precision, not simply torches or oil lamps scattered at random, but lights arranged in geometric patterns, in rectangles and circles, in constructed constellations that transformed the interior space into something between a banqueting hall and a vision of the night sky. Thousands of small lights, arranged by someone who understood both optics and beauty. The food and the service and the furnishings and the flowers and the music were all at a level of magnificence that Antony, despite all his Roman power and all his considerable experience of luxury, had simply never encountered in quite this form. He was awed. He was, for perhaps one of the few times in his adult life, slightly off balance, slightly uncertain, slightly aware that he was in the presence of something that exceeded his expectations. And after the dinner, the conversation. What they talked about, the ancient sources don't specifically preserve. But the conversation lasted for days. They met again the next night and the next, and when Antony suggested that he would host the following dinner, and that it was his turn to try to match the standard she had set. He made the attempt with a kind of self-deprecating humor, according to Plutarch, acknowledging that he couldn't achieve the same magnificence but inviting her to judge him on his merits rather than his resources. They were, in other words, getting along. And when Antony was called away from Tarsus to deal with other matters, the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire required his attention. There were Parthian threats to manage, client kings to settle. He invited himself to Egypt. He would come to Alexandria. She could show him her city. She returned to Alexandria, and Antony followed. The winter they spent together in Alexandria, 41 to 40 BCE, has been described in the ancient sources and in every retelling since, in terms of excess and romance, in terms of a world of pleasures so abundant and so various that the very word, inimitable, barely covers it. They formed what they called the Society of Inimitable Livers, a phrase in Greek that carries the sense of those who live in a manner beyond comparison, whose experience of life is beyond what ordinary people can achieve. They dined on extraordinary food, prepared by extraordinary cooks. They staged elaborate entertainments, theatrical performances, athletic competitions, philosophical debates, contests of every kind. They gambled with each other and with the court on elaborate wagers. They went out at night in disguise, wandering the streets of Alexandria as ordinary people, knocking on doors, playing games with the people they encountered, seeing their city the way its ordinary inhabitants saw it. There is a story that is preserved from this period, small but telling. Antony went fishing with Cleopatra. They were on a boat in the harbor, fishing lines in the water. Antony was not catching anything. He was embarrassed by this, the great general unable to catch a fish in front of the queen. So he quietly arranged for a servant to dive underwater and attach an already caught fish to his hook, so he could pull it up as if he had caught it himself. Cleopatra noticed. She said nothing that day. But the next day she arranged for a servant to dive underwater in advance and attach to Antony's hook a fish that had been salted and dried, a fish from the market, obviously dead before it was put in the water. Antony pulled up the hook with great ceremony and the court burst into laughter. And Cleopatra, laughing too, said something to the effect of, "Leave fishing to us, great general. The rulers of Pharaoh and Canopus know how to fish. You conquer cities and kingdoms. That is your kind of fishing. It is a small story, but it says something real." They laughed with each other. They teased each other. There was between them a quality of mutual recognition, the recognition that two highly intelligent people, both deeply serious people, can nevertheless also be friends, can tease and play and laugh together, can exist in the same space without the constant pressure of strategy and calculation that dominated every other relationship they had. They were not simply allies with a physical arrangement. They were, within the considerable constraints of who they were and what their lives required, something more than that. The winter had to end. In the spring of 40 BCE, urgent news from Rome called Antony back. His wife Fulvia, a strong-willed, politically active woman who had been managing his interests in Rome with aggressive competence, had, along with his brother Lucius, started a war with Octavian and lost. Fulvia was ill, possibly dying. The Parthians had invaded the eastern Roman provinces. The whole structure of the triumvirate was under pressure. Antony left Egypt. A few months after his departure, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. She named them Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the sun and the moon. And Antony did not come back for 3.5 years. 3.5 years. He returned to Rome and found that Fulvia had died. He found that his relationship with Octavian was badly damaged by the recent conflict. And in a move that was simultaneously politically calculated and personally significant, he married Octavian's sister Octavia. Octavia was, by all ancient accounts, an admirable woman, intelligent, dignified, loyal, patient, possessed of the qualities that Roman tradition most valued in aristocratic women. The marriage was not simply a political arrangement. It was an attempt to mend the relationship between the two most powerful men in the Roman world by creating a family connection between them. It was also, for Cleopatra, a 3.5-year silence. She ruled Egypt alone. She raised 3 children alone. Caesarion, who was growing up in the knowledge that he was the son of Julius Caesar, and the twins Alexander and Selene, who were still very small. She administered the most complex economy in the ancient world. She maintained the relationships with the Egyptian religious establishment that were the foundation of her domestic political authority. She watched the Roman world carefully and continuously. She was not idle and she was not passive. She was preparing. She was also, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, in a position of relative simplicity. There was no Roman general in the palace. There was no crisis requiring immediate navigation. There was only the work of governing, which was vast and complex and demanding, but which she was genuinely good at. There was only Egypt and the Nile, and the ancient rhythm of the floods and the harvests, and the slow, magnificent business of maintaining a civilization. These 3.5 years, poorly documented, relatively unspectacular by the dramatic standards of the rest of her reign, may have been among the most important of her life. Because in them she was simply the pharaoh. Not the queen allied with Caesar, not the queen allied with Antony, not the queen in relation to the overwhelming power of Rome. Just the queen. Hers. Think about what those years might have looked like in the day-to-day texture of her life. She would have risen each morning to the sound of Alexandria waking, the distant harbor noise, the gulls, the voices of the city beginning its daily commerce. She would have attended to the religious duties that were inseparable from the royal office, the rituals of the morning, the offerings, the prayers that connected the pharaoh to the divine world and maintained the sacred relationship on which the cosmic order depended. She would have received her advisors, her administrators, the stream of officials and petitioners and visitors that flowed through any busy court. She would have read the reports from the nome administrators across the length of Egypt, the flood measurements at the nilometers, the grain estimates, the land surveys, the records of disputes and their resolutions. She would have spent time with her children. Caesarion was growing up, moving from infant to toddler to small boy, beginning to understand something of who he was. The son of Julius Caesar, the heir of the oldest dynasty in the world, the small face that appeared on official documents alongside his mother's. The twins were born in these years, and then there was the baby Ptolemy Philadelphus at the end. 3 small lives in the royal nurseries, each with a nurse and attendants, each with a different relationship to the enormous weight of dynastic expectation. She would have walked in the gardens of the palace complex in the evenings, the colonnaded gardens with their still pools and their date palms and their careful planting of fragrant herbs. She would have looked out from her windows across the harbor at the lighthouse turning, at the ships coming and going, at the Mediterranean sky changing from the blue of afternoon to the purple of dusk to the deep blue-black of evening and then to the extraordinary clarity of the Egyptian night sky. She was thinking. She was always thinking. She was watching the reports from Rome with the same careful attention she gave to the nilometer readings, trying to detect the pattern, trying to understand where things were going, trying to be ready. And she was, in these quieter years, perhaps more fully herself than at any other time in her reign. Because the pressure of the immediate crisis was lifted and there was space. Not much space, not leisure exactly, but a little breathing room, in which she could simply be what she was. The Pharaoh of Egypt, the last in a line of 3,000 years, the living embodiment of a goddess, the ruler of a civilization. The reunion came in 37 BCE at Antioch, the great city at the northeast corner of the Mediterranean, in what is now southern Turkey close to the Syrian border. Antony needed Egypt. He was planning the Parthian campaign that had been dreamed about by Roman generals since the catastrophe of Carrhae in 53 BCE, when Crassus had marched his army into the Parthian desert and been annihilated. He needed money, enormous quantities of it, to fund an army that would have to operate far from its supply bases for months. He needed grain to feed that army. He needed ships. He needed the resources of the wealthiest kingdom in the eastern Mediterranean, and those resources were controlled by Cleopatra. She named her price. She wanted territories. She wanted Cyprus back, the island Rome had taken from her father in the humiliation of 58 BCE. She wanted the coastal territories of Phoenicia and Coele Syria. She wanted parts of Arabia and Cilicia. She wanted recognition as a genuine partner and equal, not as a client queen providing services to a Roman patron. Antony agreed. He gave her Cyprus. He gave her extensive coastal territories. He gave her the city of Jericho, which was technically within the jurisdiction of the kingdom of Herod, a detail that did not endear him to Herod, who was deeply displeased. He publicly reaffirmed his relationship with Cleopatra in a ceremony that the ancient sources describe as having the character of a marriage, though under Roman law Antony was still married to Octavia, and this ceremony had no legal standing in Roman terms. She bore him another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, in 36 BCE. This was her 4th child and her last. The Parthian campaign was a disaster. Not a minor setback or a tactical reversal, but a genuine catastrophe, the kind that marks a turning point in a man's life and a turning point in the larger story he inhabits. Antony invaded with a force of perhaps 100,000 men. The campaign plan required the capture of a heavily fortified Parthian city called Prospa, deep in the Median heartland. But his siege train, the heavy catapults and battering rams and siege towers that were necessary to assault fortified walls, was traveling separately from the main army, and before it could link up with Antony's forces, the Parthians attacked it and destroyed it. Without siege equipment he could not take the city. He tried for weeks, conducting assaults with infantry against walls that his infantry could not breach without mechanical assistance. He failed. And as the failure became evident, the Parthian cavalry began systematically picking apart his supply lines, raiding his foragers, preventing his army from living off the land. The retreat back across the Armenian highlands was one of the most grueling military experiences in the Roman record. Weeks of marching through difficult terrain, constant harassment from Parthian horsemen, inadequate food, disease, cold. He reached the coast with perhaps two-thirds of the army he had started with. Tens of thousands of men were dead. Cleopatra met him on the coast with ships and money and clothing for his soldiers and everything he needed. She had brought it all. She was there when he arrived, broken from the retreat, needing everything. He was grateful. He was, according to the ancient sources, also deeply shaken. The retreat had cost him something psychologically as well as militarily, the sense of invincibility that great generals develop over successful careers, the confidence that their judgment is fundamentally sound, had been damaged in ways that were not easily repaired. Their relationship deepened in the years that followed the Parthian disaster, taking on a quality that the ancient sources describe in ways that go beyond alliance and calculation. He was increasingly present in Alexandria, increasingly defined by his partnership with this Egyptian queen, increasingly at home in the world she inhabited rather than in the world Rome represented. And Octavian was watching. From the late 30s BCE onward, the propaganda war that Octavian conducted against Antony and Cleopatra was one of the most sophisticated and effective political campaigns in the history of the ancient world. Octavian, who would eventually rename himself Augustus, the Venerable, the Sacred, was not a man of Antony's physical courage or Antony's battlefield charisma or Antony's emotional warmth. He was small and often physically unwell. He was cold where Antony was warm, calculating where Antony was impulsive, methodical where Antony was spontaneous. He understood that in the competition between the two men for ultimate supremacy, a direct military confrontation was not inevitable and not necessarily the most effective approach. There was another battlefield, the imagination of the Roman people. The story he told about Antony was this: a great Roman has been seduced and corrupted by a foreign queen. He has abandoned his Roman wife, Octavia, Octavian's own sister, a noble and dignified woman, for an Eastern enchantress. He has forgotten his Roman identity, adopted Eastern customs, allowed himself to be surrounded by luxury and excess that no Roman general should countenance. He has given away Roman-controlled territories to this foreign queen as gifts, as love tokens, as evidence of how completely she controls him. He has designated her children who are not legitimate Roman heirs, as rulers of enormous swaths of the Roman world. He has been domesticated, emasculated, transformed from a Roman into something else, something Eastern, something that Rome should be afraid of. The climax of this propaganda was the revelation of Antony's will, which Octavian took from the Vestal Virgins, where Antony had deposited it, and read publicly before the Roman Senate. Whether the will he read was genuine or altered or fabricated outright, is a question that cannot be settled from the surviving evidence. What it supposedly said was this: Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra. He recognized Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, as Caesar's legitimate heir. That last element was the most explosive. Octavian's entire claim to power rested on his identity as Caesar's adopted son and heir. If Caesarion was Caesar's legitimate biological son and therefore Caesar's true heir, Octavian's claim was not merely weakened, it was nullified. Two Caesars was one too many. Octavian had understood this from the beginning, and it was one of the reasons that Caesarion would never be allowed to survive the defeat of his mother. Rome stripped Antony of his powers. The Senate declared war on Cleopatra. Not technically on Antony, officially because declaring war on a Roman citizen would mean naming this a civil war, which Rome was still psychologically resistant to doing. Officially, this was a war against a foreign queen who had bewitched a Roman man and threatened Roman security. Antony was merely a casualty of her manipulation. The propaganda was working. Actium. On the western coast of Greece, near the entrance to the Ambracian Gulf, in the early autumn of 31 BCE, the fleets faced each other. The situation before the battle was already not good for Antony and Cleopatra. Octavian's naval commander Marcus Agrippa, one of the most gifted military minds of his generation, a man whose abilities in both land and naval warfare were extraordinary, had spent the previous months systematically degrading their position. He had captured key ports. He had disrupted their supply lines. He had intercepted convoys. His operations had been so effective that by the time of the battle Antony's forces were weakened by disease, by shortage of food, by the steady hemorrhage of desertions. Key commanders who had been with Antony for years were going over to Octavian, not because they had been persuaded by propaganda but because they could read the military situation and see which way it was pointing. The battle was fought on September 2, 31 BCE. The full tactical picture of what happened at Actium is something that historians have debated and reconstructed for 2,000 years, drawing on incomplete and sometimes contradictory ancient accounts. What seems clear is this: at some point during the naval engagement, the squadron of ships that Cleopatra commanded, which had been positioned toward the rear, perhaps waiting for an opening to break through to the open sea, turned and sailed south toward Egypt. Antony followed her. His fleet, suddenly without its commander in the middle of a battle, fought for a time and then broke apart. Some ships surrendering to Octavian, others fleeing, the formation disintegrating. The land army, which had been waiting on shore to see how the naval engagement developed, learned what had happened over the following days and capitulated to Octavian almost without resistance. Why did Cleopatra leave? Every account of Actium must engage with this question, and no account can answer it definitively. The ancient sources that are hostile to Cleopatra, which is most of them because most of them were written by Romans working in the tradition that Octavian had constructed, say simply that she fled in cowardice and took Antony with her, abandoning their forces to destruction. The sources that are more sympathetic suggest that the withdrawal was a rational military calculation in an already lost situation, that breaking through to preserve the fleet and the treasury and the ability to continue the war from Egypt was the best available option. Neither explanation is entirely satisfying. What can be said is this: by the autumn of 31 BCE, the military situation was already severely compromised before any battle was fought. The strategic initiative had been with Octavian for months. The steady erosion of their forces through disease and desertion and the loss of key commanders had changed the calculus of what was achievable. The question was no longer whether they could win the war but whether they could preserve enough to continue it. Perhaps the withdrawal was precisely that, a strategic preservation of assets, a decision to fight another day from a stronger position. Perhaps it was something more complicated, a failure of nerve at the critical moment, a misreading of the tactical situation. Perhaps it was both. The truth of what happened in Cleopatra's mind on that September day, as she watched the battle and made her decision, is something that no surviving source records with the reliability we would need to know for certain. What followed the withdrawal, however, is clear. Antony arrived in Egypt in a condition of profound psychological devastation. The ancient sources describe him sitting alone at the bow of his ship for days, his head in his hands, refusing to speak or eat. He had lost everything. He had commanded one of the largest military forces ever assembled in the eastern Mediterranean, and it was gone. He had been in position to dominate the Roman world, and that position was gone. His soldiers had deserted him, his commanders had abandoned him, and the battle that was supposed to decide the future had gone catastrophically wrong. He built himself a small retreat on a breakwater in Alexandria's harbor, calling it the Timoneum, after Timon of Athens, the misanthrope who retreated from human society in disgust. He spent time there alone, apart from Cleopatra and the court. And then gradually life asserted itself. They found their way back to each other. They had nowhere else to go, and no one else who could understand the scale of what had happened. Octavian was moving. He was in no hurry. He settled affairs in Greece. He received the surrender of client kings. He organized the administrative aftermath of his victory. He moved methodically east through Asia Minor and Syria, accepting submissions and making arrangements, while Antony and Cleopatra in Alexandria dealt with the reality of what was coming. Cleopatra was not passive. She was attempting to negotiate. She sent gifts to Octavian, valuable objects, part of the treasury. She received his messengers with careful attention, trying to read from their responses and their manner what Octavian actually wanted, what terms he might genuinely accept. She was trying to find a path through an apparently impossible situation. She was also preparing other options. There are ancient accounts of her collecting ships in the Red Sea, perhaps planning to sail with her treasury and her remaining forces to India or Arabia, to a place beyond Octavian's reach, to begin again. Whether this was a genuine plan or merely an option being explored or simply a rumor that Octavian's sources picked up and passed on, cannot be determined. But the story is consistent with what we know of how she thought. She was always looking for another way, always looking for the angle that her adversaries had not anticipated. She was also, according to Plutarch, researching methods of dying. She asked her physicians to investigate various poisons and their effects, how quickly they acted, how painlessly. She had experiments conducted on condemned prisoners to observe the differences between various methods. This is a detail that shocks modern sensibilities, but it was not without precedent in the ancient world, and the context makes it comprehensible if not comfortable. She had watched what happened to captives in Roman triumphs. She had watched her sister Arsinoe displayed in chains in Caesar's Egyptian triumph years before. She understood what a Roman triumph required: a living captive queen, displayed in chains in the procession, available for public humiliation. She had understood for months, possibly for years, that she was the intended centerpiece of Octavian's triumph. She was not going to be that. She also had something else she was trying to protect. She had apparently asked Octavian, through intermediaries, to allow her children to inherit Egypt, to allow the Ptolemaic dynasty to continue in the persons of Caesarion and the children of Antony, even if she herself was required to abdicate. She was willing to sacrifice her own position if it meant her children's safety and Egypt's continuity under Ptolemaic rule. Octavian sent back responses that were deliberately vague. He did not say yes. He did not say no. He maintained her uncertainty because her uncertainty kept her from taking actions, destroying the treasury for instance, which she had apparently threatened to do rather than allow it to fall into Roman hands. That would have been inconvenient for him. In the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian crossed the eastern border of Egypt. The forces that were supposed to defend the frontier largely surrendered or simply dissolved. There was not much of a defense. The will to resist had been eroded by the reality of the situation. There was one last military gesture. Antony led an attack against Octavian's advancing forces and achieved a small tactical success, a brief engagement that went in his favor. He returned to Alexandria genuinely elated, and he and Cleopatra celebrated as if they had reversed the momentum of everything. Perhaps they needed this moment. Perhaps the human capacity for hope, the completely irrational but entirely necessary human capacity for hope, required this brief brightness before what came next. The next day the fleet surrendered to Octavian. Antony received a report that Cleopatra was dead. The source and the nature of this report is not entirely clear in the ancient accounts, whether it was a deliberate deception, a genuine error, or a misunderstanding of some kind. But he believed it, and believing it he fell on his own sword. The wound was serious but not immediately fatal. He lay dying while the news was clarified. Cleopatra was not dead, she was in her monument, she had barricaded herself inside the mausoleum she had been constructing for herself. He was carried to the monument, bleeding, in agony. She did not open the door. She was afraid that if she opened the door, Octavian's soldiers would rush in and take her. So she and her two serving women, a woman named Iris and a woman named Charmian, lowered ropes from a window high above the ground. They hauled him up, a dying man, through the window of a tomb. And Cleopatra held him as he died. He died in her arms in her own mausoleum, in August of 30 BCE. She was 39 years old. Octavian came to see her. He was 23 years old. He was about to become the undisputed master of the entire Mediterranean world. He was young and cold and absolutely clear about what he needed. He needed her alive. The triumph he was planning, the 3-day military celebration with which Roman generals marked their victories over foreign enemies, required a captive. She was the enemy. She was the centerpiece of the spectacle. Without her, the triumph would be incomplete. The ancient account of their meeting, from Plutarch, is one of the most quietly devastating passages in all of ancient literature. Cleopatra was in a state she had never been seen in before. She had been grieving, genuinely, openly, without the political calculation that had shaped her public behavior for 2 decades. She had torn her garments in the ancient Egyptian gesture of mourning. She had clawed her own face and breast in the ancient ritual of grief. She was not presenting herself as a queen. She was presenting herself as a woman who had just watched the man she loved die in her arms. Octavian saw this and understood it, and it did not move him. He was polite. He was reassuring. He told her she would be treated well. He was careful not to say anything definitive, careful to maintain her hope without making promises he could not keep. She listened. She watched him with the eyes of someone who had been reading people all her adult life. She thought about what she saw. And she worked. A few days later, a man arrived with a basket of figs. Or the figs were merely the cover story. Or they were real figs, and inside the basket, hidden in the figs or in the leaves packed around them, was something else. The ancient sources give slightly different accounts of exactly how the asp, or the Egyptian cobra, or whatever it was, came to be in Cleopatra's monument on that August day in 30 BCE. Plutarch mentions the basket of figs. Some ancient sources mention a hollow hairpin or comb. Some suggest poison applied directly without any snake. The details are inconsistent, and they have been inconsistent from very shortly after her death, which is itself significant, because it suggests that even at the time, the precise method was uncertain or unknown. What is certain is that on approximately August 12, 30 BCE, Cleopatra was found dead in her monument. Her two serving women, Iras and Charmian, were also dead or dying. According to Plutarch, when one of Octavian's guards rushed in and discovered the scene, he found Charmian still barely alive, adjusting the diadem on Cleopatra's head, arranging the queen's crown. The guard demanded angrily whether this was well done. Charmian's response, with her last breath or close to it, has been preserved in Plutarch's text. "Perfectly well done," she said. "And fitting for a queen descended of so many kings." She died. Octavian, frustrated and furious that he had lost his captive for the triumph, sent for the Psylli, specialists in treating snake bite, men from North Africa who were believed to have special knowledge of the treatment of envenomation, to try to revive her. They failed. She was gone. He arranged a funeral for her. He had her buried beside Antony as she had wished. He honored that much of her last request. And then he killed Caesarion. The boy, 17 years old, the son of Julius Caesar, the last Ptolemaic heir in the male line, had been sent south before Octavian's arrival, perhaps in the hope that he could be evacuated to India or Ethiopia. Octavian's agents found him and brought him back. The debate among Octavian's advisors was apparently brief. Someone quoted a line of Homer that could be translated approximately, "Two Caesars is too many." Caesarion was executed. The three children of Cleopatra and Antony, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were taken to Rome. They were paraded in Octavian's triumph, as Cleopatra herself could not be. Then they were placed in the household of Octavia, Antony's abandoned Roman wife, Octavian's sister, to be raised. The children of the queen who had in Roman propaganda stolen Octavia's husband were raised by Octavia herself. Cleopatra Selene survived. She eventually married Juba II, the king of Mauritania in North Africa, and lived into adulthood. She became a cultivated and educated queen in her own right, and the tiny ancient coin portraits of her show a face with echoes of her mother's strong features. Her brothers Alexander and Ptolemy disappear from the historical record without further trace. When or how they died is unknown. Egypt became a Roman province. The Ptolemaic dynasty was over. 3,000 years of pharaonic tradition ended with a woman who was 39 years old, dead in her own mausoleum, with her crown adjusted on her head by a dying servant who was determined that she would be found looking like the queen she was. Or it tried to end. History moves on in its official version. In dates and administrative records and the formal processes by which one governing structure is replaced by another. Egypt became a province. The Roman prefects arrived. The Nile taxes began flowing to Rome rather than to Alexandria. This happened. It was real. But history is not only its official version. The official version is what gets written in the records of the victors. The other version, the version that lives in memory, in story, in the images people carry with them through generations, is more stubborn, less manageable, and often more true. Cleopatra refused to be forgotten. Not immediately. What was immediately remembered was Octavian's version. The dangerous seductress. The Eastern enchantress. The woman who had used her body and her foreign magic to corrupt a good Roman man. The Roman poet Horace wrote his famous ode on the news of her death, Nunc est bibendum, now we must drink, and within that poem described her as fatale monstrum, a deadly monster, a queen who had made depraved plans to bring destruction to Rome and to the capital. He acknowledged, almost against his will, almost grudgingly, that in choosing death over captivity she had shown something that resembled courage. But the framing was clear. She was a threat that had been dealt with, an enemy that had been defeated. This was the Cleopatra that Roman literature transmitted to the centuries that followed. The dangerous foreign queen. The seductress. The cautionary tale about the costs of surrendering Roman virtue to Eastern luxury and Eastern temptation. But other things were also transmitted. Plutarch, writing perhaps a century and a half after her death, produced a portrait of genuine complexity. He was not without Roman biases, but he was too honest and too careful a historian to reduce her to a simple symbol. His Cleopatra is real, intelligent, present, capable, complicated, a person rather than an emblem. His famous observation that what captivated people about her was not her physical beauty but her conversation and her character, the quality of her presence and her voice. This was an act of genuine historical perception that refused the easy reduction. And Egypt remembered differently. The Egyptian people, who had watched 300 years of Ptolemaic rulers and had seen none of them take the trouble to learn their language or to identify with their goddess or to engage with their ancient tradition as Cleopatra had, carried a different memory. She had been Isis, the goddess made flesh. The mythology of Isis, who had gathered the scattered pieces of her murdered husband, who had protected her son against overwhelming force, who had refused to be defeated by chaos and destruction, had played itself out, in some sense, in the life of the last queen. The goddess had lived among them. She had ruled them and loved them and fought for them. And she had chosen, in the end, to die rather than to be displayed in chains by her enemies. The cult of Isis did not die with Cleopatra. It spread. Isis temples appeared throughout the Roman Empire in the decades after the conquest of Egypt. In Rome itself, in Gaul and Spain and Britain and the provinces along the Danube. The goddess whom Cleopatra had embodied became one of the most widely worshipped deities of the ancient world. Her attributes: the protective mother, the faithful wife, the wise queen, the mistress of magic, the one who triumphed over death through love, resonating across cultures and centuries in ways that no political calculation could have predicted or controlled. Cleopatra had not simply been extinguished. She had been transformed. The question of what she actually looked like has generated more debate and more invention than almost any comparable historical question. The popular image is familiar: a face of perfect symmetrical beauty, large dark eyes heavily lined with kohl, a full mouth, a body of spectacular proportions draped in silk and jewels. This image comes primarily from 19th-century paintings and 20th-century films. It reflects the fantasies of those centuries about the exotic East, about feminine beauty as spectacle, about the Orient as a place of dangerous luxury and dangerous women. It tells us a great deal about European and American culture in the Victorian and modern eras and almost nothing about the actual woman. What we actually have, in terms of visual evidence, are primarily the coins. Coins minted during Cleopatra's reign, coins issued in her own name from her own royal treasury, bearing her portrait, show a woman whose appearance is striking and distinctive but not conventionally beautiful by any ancient or modern standard. The features are strong: a prominent nose that is notably aquiline, high cheekbones, a firm jawline, a high forehead. The hair is typically dressed in the melon style, pulled back from the forehead, gathered behind the head, with the characteristic small bun. The expression is serious and direct. She looks like someone who is thinking. She looks like someone with authority. The nose, in particular, is worth noting, not because of its shape but because of what its presence on the coins tells us about the woman who ordered the coins made. In any period of history, the people who control how their image appears on official currency are making deliberate choices about how they want to be perceived. The coin portrait is the official portrait, the portrait intended to represent the ruler to every person in the kingdom who handles money, which is to say essentially everyone. Cleopatra could have instructed her artist to soften her features, to idealize her portrait in the way that rulers so often did. She did not. She appears on her coins as she was: strong features, prominent nose, an expression not of feminine beauty but of sovereign authority. She was not trying to be beautiful. She was trying to be recognized. There are marble portraits that some scholars have identified as Cleopatra, most famously a head now in the Vatican museums that bear some resemblance to the coin portraits. These identifications are debated and should be held tentatively. But they are consistent with the same general picture: a face that is striking and strong but not soft, a face that belongs to someone who has been in the world and thought hard about it. The ancient description that Plutarch gives us, that it was her conversation and her character that captivated people, not her physical appearance, is entirely consistent with what the coins show us. She was not marketing herself as a beautiful woman. She was presenting herself as a ruler, a thinker, a person. This is, in its own way, one of the most radical things about her. In an age that used physical beauty as the primary framework for describing and evaluating women, in an age where the highest praise a woman could receive was a comparison to Aphrodite or Helen of Troy, Cleopatra simply declined to be evaluated on those terms. She put her actual face on coins and said, "This is who I am. This is what power looks like." She was right. And the world has been unable to see past its own invented version of her ever since. 3,000 years of pharaonic tradition ended with her. This is the largest frame in which her story can be understood, and it is worth dwelling on, because the scale of it tends to get lost in the more personal and dramatic elements of her biography. The Egyptian conception of the pharaoh was not simply political. The pharaoh was not merely a king in the way that the word king means in European political tradition, a powerful ruler, perhaps a semi-divine figure, but ultimately a human being managing a human institution. The Egyptian pharaoh was something different and something more. The pharaoh was the living Horus, the god of the sky, the son of Osiris, the rightful ruler of the world. When the pharaoh performed the daily rituals of the temple, he was not merely worshipping the gods, he was maintaining the cosmic order, Ma'at, the principle of balance and right relationship that held the universe together. When the pharaoh died and his successor took the throne, the dead pharaoh became Osiris, lord of the underworld, god of death and resurrection, and the new king became Horus. The cycle of death and renewal, of the sun setting and rising, of the Nile flooding and receding, was linked to and sustained by this perpetual movement of the royal soul through its divine identities. This was not metaphor. This was not merely symbolic language dressed in religious costume. This was, for the Egyptian people across 3,000 years, literal truth, the literal structure of the universe as they understood it. When Cleopatra died, the cycle stopped. There was no new Horus. There was no new pharaoh. There were Roman prefects, efficient and impersonal, managing a province for the benefit of a distant empire. The temples continued to function. The Romans were pragmatic about local religion, understanding that disrupting it created more trouble than it was worth, and Egyptian religious life continued in recognizable form for several more centuries. But the sacred kingship was gone. The living God was gone. The figure whose role was to stand between the human world and the divine, whose job was to maintain the relationship between earth and heaven, whose identity was simultaneously human and divine. This figure was gone and would not be replaced. Egypt continued as a place, as a culture, as a collection of human beings with their own identity and their own traditions. But Egypt as the oldest continuous state in the world, as the living embodiment of a 3,000-year-old conception of sacred governance, as the place where the pharaoh was the pivot around which the cosmic order turned, this Egypt ended with Cleopatra. And she understood this. This is perhaps the thing most worth saying about her, the thing that ties all the other things together. She understood the scale of what she was holding. She understood that she was not merely a queen in the political sense, a ruler of a territory with borders and armies and tax revenue, but a sacred custodian. She was holding something that had been passed down, unbroken, for 3,000 years. She was the last link in a chain that stretched back to before writing, to before the first dynasty, to the mythological time when Osiris himself ruled the land of Egypt. And she bore that responsibility with seriousness. Not as a burden but as a calling. Not reluctantly but with full commitment. She learned the language of her people. She learned their religion. She performed their rituals. She maintained their temples. She presented herself, in her public life and in her theology and in the reliefs carved on the walls of her temples, as genuinely Egyptian, genuinely the pharaoh, genuinely the living goddess who had come among them to tend the sacred order. And when the time came that she could not maintain it any longer, when the force arrayed against her was too great, when the military and political situation was beyond repair, when the options had been exhausted, she chose her own ending. She died as the pharaoh in her monument, with her crown on her head, with her servants beside her. She maintained the dignity of the office to the last breath. She gave Charmian the opportunity to arrange the crown and die with that last proud declaration. Perfectly well done, and fitting for a queen descended of so many kings. There is something to dwell on in the figure of Charmian, that serving woman who stayed beside her queen to the end, who used her last moments of consciousness to adjust the crown on a dead woman's head, who answered the Roman guard's question with a sentence that contained, compressed within it, the entire weight of 3,000 years of Egyptian royal tradition. Perfectly well done. And fitting for a queen descended of so many kings. Those kings stretched back in an unbroken line to before the written word. To Narmer, who was perhaps the first pharaoh, who appears on a carved stone pallet that is nearly 5,000 years old, shown conquering his enemies in the stylized manner that Egyptian royal iconography would use for the next 3 millennia. To the builders of the pyramids, Khufu, Khafre, Menkaure, whose tombs still stand on the Giza plateau and whose faces, in the surviving portrait sculpture, look out from their stone with an expression of absolute, transcendent serenity. To Thutmose III, the great general pharaoh who extended the Egyptian empire to its greatest extent. To Ramesses II, who ruled for 67 years and fought at Kadesh and built Abu Simbel and covered the walls of temples from the Nile Delta to the Fourth Cataract with images of his own divine face. All of these kings. All of these pharaohs. All of these living Horuses who had stood between the human world and the divine, who had maintained Ma'at against the forces of chaos, who had ensured that the Nile would flood and the crops would grow and the sun would rise each morning. Cleopatra was the last of them. And Charmian, with her last breath, with the last act of her life, made sure the last one was found wearing her crown. That is a kind of loyalty that goes beyond the personal. It is a loyalty to the thing itself, to the office, to the tradition, to the 3,000 years of accumulated meaning that the crown represented. Charmian died insisting that the meaning mattered. Died insisting that the dignity of the thing was real even when the power behind it had been extinguished. It was, as she said, perfectly well done. What would have happened if Actium had gone differently? This is a question that cannot be answered, and that imagination cannot resist. Antony and Cleopatra had conceived of something together, something that went beyond the personal alliance between a Roman general and an Egyptian queen. In the donations of Alexandria, that ceremony in 34 BCE where Antony had declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings and divided the Eastern world among their children, there was a vision of the world that was genuinely different from what Octavian represented. Not a Roman world, organized around the city of Rome and the Roman conception of order and power and culture. Not a world in which Rome was the center and everything else was the periphery. But a world in which the great civilizations of the East, Egypt with its 3,000 years, Persia with its ancient empire, the various cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean, were genuine participants rather than conquered territories. A world in which the eastern and the western halves of the Mediterranean had a genuinely reciprocal relationship, each contributing what was particular to it, each respecting the particular genius of the other. This vision was imperfect and imperfectly realized. Antony was a Roman general, not a philosopher king, and his conception of the East was shaped by Roman assumptions even when he was challenging Roman assumptions. Cleopatra was a pragmatist who understood that any arrangement she entered into had to be one she could actually govern within. The vision of a plural Mediterranean was never fully articulated, never reduced to a manifesto or a philosophical statement. But it was visible. It was present in their choices and their arrangements. And it was, perhaps, the most genuinely threatening thing about them, not the military alliance, not the wealth, not the territorial claims, but the idea. The idea that Rome did not have to be everything. It died at Actium. Octavian won and became Augustus, and the Roman Empire that he founded organized the Mediterranean world around the singular dominance of Rome for the next 5 centuries. What Cleopatra and Antony had imagined was swept away. But it was imagined. And in the history of human thought, what has been imagined never entirely disappears. It waits, submerged, until the conditions exist for it to surface again. Let us consider for a moment the question of legacy, not the legacy of conquest or of dynasty which ended with her, but the quieter and more durable legacy of a life that was genuinely, fully lived. What does it mean to have governed well? In the ancient world, as in our own, the question is not simple. The records left by victors tend to describe governance in terms of military achievement, territorial expansion, the crushing of enemies. The Augustan histories celebrate Augustus's reign in terms of the peace he imposed and the monuments he built and the enemies he defeated. These are real things and they matter. But there is another kind of governance, the kind that leaves fewer monuments and fewer triumphant inscriptions, that consists in the careful maintenance of the systems that allow ordinary human beings to live their lives in dignity. The irrigation canal that is cleared before the flood season. The grain reserve that is maintained against the bad year. The dispute between neighbors that is resolved fairly. The temple that is repaired so that the ritual can continue. The tax rate that is set at a level people can actually pay. Cleopatra, in the 21 years of her reign, did these things. She kept the Nile economy functioning. She maintained the religious institutions that were the source of cultural continuity and psychological stability for her people. She managed her kingdom's relationships with the surrounding powers, Rome above all, but also the Nabatean Arabs and the Judean monarchy and the peoples of Nubia to the south, with skill and care. She kept Egypt independent for as long as it could be kept independent, and when independence was no longer possible, she tried to negotiate the best possible terms for her children and her civilization. She did not succeed entirely. She failed to keep Egypt independent. She failed to protect Caesarion. She failed to establish the plural Mediterranean world that she and Antony had glimpsed. These are real failures and they should not be minimized. But failure and success are not the only categories available. There is also the question of whether someone met the demands of their situation with everything they had, whether they brought the full weight of their intelligence and their dedication and their care to the task they were given, even when the task was impossible. By that measure, Cleopatra did not fail. By that measure, she was extraordinary. The story of how she was remembered, and misremembered, and reinvented, is itself worth following because it tells us something about what people in different ages needed from her image. In the immediate aftermath of her death, the image that prevailed was Octavian's, the dangerous foreign queen, the Eastern enchantress, the cautionary tale. This was the version that Roman literature transmitted. Horace's ode, written within months of her death, describes her as a monster and credits her only grudgingly with a certain courage in her dying. Virgil's Aeneid, the great epic of Roman destiny, depicts Actium as a cosmic struggle between Roman order and Eastern chaos, with Cleopatra on the side of chaos, the dog-headed Egyptian gods against the clean Olympians of Rome. Propertius wrote an elegy in which a Roman man who has fallen for a woman like Cleopatra laments his own degradation. These texts were not merely expressing personal opinions. They were constructing a usable past. They were telling Rome a story about itself that served the present purposes of the Augustan regime. Rome had faced a great danger, Rome had triumphed, Rome was now safe under the wise guidance of Augustus who had saved it from the Eastern threat. Cleopatra's death was the proof of Roman virtue's ultimate victory over Eastern vice. This image, stripped of its specific political context, generalized into a pattern, proved extraordinarily durable. The dangerous Eastern queen, the woman of excessive beauty and excessive ambition, the figure who seduces and destroys, this archetype was too useful, too resonant with anxieties that ran deeper than any particular political moment, to be easily exhausted. The medieval period inherited this image through the Roman texts that survived and added theological dimensions to it. Dante's placement of Cleopatra in the second circle of hell, among the lustful, reflects the Christian moral framework's particular concerns, but the underlying structure, the dangerous woman punished for her excessive desire, was already present in the Roman tradition. The Renaissance complicated this picture. The recovery of more complete ancient texts, the revival of classical learning, the general Renaissance interest in powerful women as figures both admirable and threatening, these forces produced a more ambivalent image. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, written around 1607 and drawing extensively on North's translation of Plutarch, is the great monument of this ambivalence. Shakespeare's Cleopatra is theatrical and calculating and genuinely feeling and magnificent and frightened and strategically brilliant and capable of a love that is, in the end, bigger than her politics. She is not a simple villain and not a simple heroine. She is a person, the most complex female character in the Shakespearean canon, and perhaps in the English dramatic tradition. What Shakespeare understood, or what his Plutarch understood, is that the interesting thing about Cleopatra was not her beauty or her seductiveness but her mind. The great speech that Enobarbus gives, the famous description of the barge at Tarsus, is not simply an account of physical spectacle. It is an account of total mastery, of a woman who has understood the relationship between theatrical image and political reality so completely that she can produce, in a single afternoon on a river, an effect that permanently alters the terms of her relationship with the most powerful Roman in the East. The Romantic period gave her sentiment and tragedy. The Victorian period gave her exoticism and moral cautionary weight. The 20th century gave her Hollywood and the image, most completely realized in the 1963 Elizabeth Taylor film, of spectacular physical beauty and spectacular excess. None of these images is false exactly. Each contains something real. But each also reflects the preoccupations of its own age more than it reflects the actual woman. What each age needed from Cleopatra, it found in Cleopatra, or projected onto her. The actual woman, the one who spent her evenings reading by lamplight, who learned Egyptian so she could speak to her priests without an interpreter, who received the ambassadors of foreign kingdoms in their own languages, who managed the irrigation system of the Nile Delta and the astronomical observations of the Memphis priests and the commercial regulations of the Alexandrian harbor simultaneously. This woman is harder to see through the layers of interpretation. But she is there. She has always been there. Waiting with the patience of the Pharaoh to be found. The night is deepening now. There is a quality to the very late hours that is different from the earlier parts of the night, a different quality of silence, a different quality of darkness. The sounds that belong to the evening have faded. The particular sounds that belong to the very late hours, the distant settling of a building, the sound of breathing, the occasional almost noise of a city that is as quiet as it ever gets, have taken over. And in this particular quality of quiet, the past has a way of becoming present. Not intrusively. Not dramatically. Just gently present, the way the past is always present if you pay attention to it, layered beneath the surface of the current moment, like the Nile silt beneath the fields that were planted and planted again for 3,000 years. Think of Alexandria. Think of it as it was in the century before the Common Era, that extraordinary city on the Mediterranean coast, at the edge of the oldest civilization in the world and the entrance to the most dynamic commercial network in the ancient world. Think of the harbor, with its enormous lighthouse casting its beam across the dark water. Think of the smells, The salt of the sea and the green smell of the Nile and the incense from the temples and the complicated organic smell of a city where 1 million human beings are going about the business of their lives simultaneously. Think of the palace complex on its peninsula, the colonnaded gardens with their still pools reflecting the night sky, the sound of fountains playing in the darkness, the smell of the flowers that bloomed in those gardens, lotus and jasmine and the fragrant herbs of the Levant. Think of the lamplight in the windows, the warm orange glow of oil lamps visible through the columns of the colonnades, making the palace complex look, from across the harbor, like something between a city and a constellation. In one of those windows a lamp is burning late. In the light of that lamp, a woman is reading. She is perhaps 25 years old or 30, or some other age that we cannot precisely determine. She is reading from a papyrus scroll, the dry, slightly rough texture of the papyrus under her fingers, the brown ink visible against the pale yellow surface, the hieroglyphic signs and the Greek letters both present in her sight, both familiar, both transparent to her in the way that language is transparent to someone who has made it fully their own. She reads both scripts with the same ease that she hears both languages when they are spoken, without effort, without translation, without the slight cognitive friction that comes from working in a language that is not quite native. She is reading, perhaps a medical text from the Egyptian priestly tradition, or a philosophical treatise in Greek, or a document from one of the provincial administrators of the Nile Valley, or a record of the temple accounts, or an astronomical table, or a letter from a Roman general. She reads everything. She has always read everything. The lamp burns steadily. The harbor is dark and still. The lighthouse on Pharos casts its slow beam across the water, illuminating briefly and then passing on. The lighthouse beam that has been turning for 100 years before her birth and will continue turning for centuries after her death. She reads, and she thinks about what she has read, and she thinks about her kingdom and her people and the enormous weight of 3,000 years of continuity that she has inherited and is responsible for maintaining. She thinks about what she owes them. She thinks, everything. And she sets down the scroll and she rests her eyes for a moment, and outside the window the harbor is black and silver and the stars are turning in their ancient paths and the Nile, somewhere to the east, is moving north as it always has, carrying its silt toward the sea, indifferent to everything except the direction of its own inexorable flow. The questions she was asking in those late hours by lamplight are not so different from the questions that have occupied human beings in every generation. How do you hold something precious in a world that wants to take it from you? How do you remain who you are when the forces around you are demanding that you be something else? How do you govern wisely when wisdom alone is not enough, when wisdom must be accompanied by power, and power requires alliances, and alliances require compromises that wisdom might not entirely approve? She did not always answer these questions well. She made mistakes, political mistakes, strategic mistakes, possibly personal mistakes, though it is hard to assess personal mistakes from across 2,000 years. She operated in conditions of extreme difficulty and extreme pressure that most people never face, and she operated in those conditions with a level of skill and intelligence and commitment that most people never achieve. And she asked one question consistently and clearly throughout her reign: what does Egypt need? Not what does Rome need? Not what do I need to survive? Not what does the situation require? But what does Egypt need? What does this ancient civilization, this 3,000-year project of understanding the world and tending the relationship between the human and the divine, actually require from its custodian? This is, in its own way, the most remarkable thing about her. Not the languages or the learning or the political skill or the ability to captivate Caesar and Antony. Those things were extraordinary, but they were instruments. What they were in service of was the question she was always asking, the question she answered in every decision she made: what does Egypt need? She gave Egypt 21 years of competent, engaged, deeply committed governance. She gave it the dignity of a ruler who took it seriously as itself, not as a prize to be exploited, not as a client state to be managed, not as a geographic and economic asset to be organized for someone else's benefit, but as a civilization worth preserving, a tradition worth maintaining, a people worth governing with full attention and full care. And when she could no longer give it those things, when the world had moved in a direction that made everything she had built impossible to continue, she gave it the last gift she could. She died on her own terms, with her crown on, rather than allow herself to be displayed as a symbol of its defeat. It was enough. It was, in the world she inhabited and given the forces arrayed against her, everything. The lamp is burning very low now. The oil is nearly gone. The flame is smaller than it was an hour ago, smaller than it was at the beginning of the night, but still steady, still burning, still casting its warm circle of light onto the papyrus scroll, onto the hand that holds it, onto the quiet face of the woman reading by its light. In a little while the oil will be exhausted and the flame will go out. But the darkness that follows is not empty. The window is beginning to show, at its edges, the first very faint lightning that precedes the dawn, not true light yet, not the gold of sunrise, but the darkest blue becoming slightly less dark, the sky beginning to remember that it can be other colors than black. The stars are beginning, almost imperceptibly, to fade. The city is still sleeping. The harbor is still. The lighthouse beam still moves across the water, but the water is no longer purely black. It has taken on a quality of deep blue, the particular blue of the sea in the hour before dawn, when the darkness is releasing its hold and the world is suspended between what the night has been and what the day will bring. The woman by the lamp has fallen asleep over her scroll, or perhaps she has set it down deliberately and closed her eyes, letting the thoughts settle, letting the reading dissolve into something more diffuse and more restful. The city breathes. The Nile moves. The flame goes out. And in the darkness before the dawn, everything that has happened in this story rests quietly in its place. The library with its hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the palace with its gardens and its fountains, the temples with their ancient reliefs and their ancient rituals, the children sleeping in their rooms, the harbor with its ships from every corner of the world, the lighthouse on its island turning its slow beam through the darkness. This moment, this particular arrangement of things will not last. Nothing lasts in the form it takes. The palace will one day be under water. The library will one day be empty. The temples will stand for centuries, but the rituals performed in them will eventually cease. The city will change and change again and be conquered and liberated and changed again, and the name of the queen who ruled here will be spoken in languages she never heard, in countries she never imagined, by people who are trying, as we are trying tonight, to see through the layers of myth and invention and propaganda to find out who she actually was. And who she actually was is this: a woman who understood that power is not just force but also care. A woman who learned 9 languages to be closer to the people she governed. A woman who read the sacred texts of a 3,000-year tradition in their original script and took responsibility for maintaining that tradition. A woman who faced an ending with her eyes open and chose, in that ending, to remain herself. The Pharaoh. The last one. Isis on earth. Let the story rest here, in this gentle space between the lamp going out and the dawn coming on. Let the images settle into you slowly, the way knowledge settles into understanding. Not all at once, not as a single bright moment of insight, but gradually, over time, becoming part of how you see the world. The harbor. The lighthouse. The lamplight on the scroll. The sound of the Nile, far away, moving north. Let your breathing slow. Let the body rest where it is, warm and comfortable, in its own present moment. Let the ancient world recede gently into its proper distance. Not gone, never quite gone, but resting now, quiet, in the deep layers of history where the past waits with the patience of something that knows it will always be there. The stars are turning slowly overhead. The same stars. The ones she knew. The ones the priests of Memphis had mapped and named and interpreted for 30 centuries before she was born. They are still there. Patient and vast and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are simply themselves, without effort, without performance, without the need for anything from anyone. They shine on the sea and they shine on the desert and they shine on the ruins of cities that thought they would endure forever. They shine on you, right now, wherever you are resting, and they are the same stars that shone on Alexandria in the last century before the calendar changed. This is the continuity that survives everything. The light. The light of lamps reading scrolls in ancient libraries. The light of the lighthouse beam moving across the dark water. The light of stars too far away to measure. The light of a story that has been told and retold for 2,000 years and that comes to you now, in the late hours of your own particular night, as it has come to people in every generation since her death. The story of a woman who knew what she was, who knew what she owed, and who paid that debt in full. A woman who refused to be forgotten. Who was forgotten anyway in the version her enemies wrote. And who was found again and again and again, by every generation that needed her, in whatever form they needed her. Because the truth of a life that was genuinely and fully lived cannot be permanently buried. It surfaces. It endures. It waits in the deep layers, the way the silt of the Nile waits in the fields, invisible and patient, feeding everything that grows. Rest now. Let the Nile carry you. It has been carrying things for longer than memory, longer than history, longer than the first Pharaoh raised the double crown. It is moving north, always north, slow and enormous and completely patient, and it will carry you too, gently, without effort, in the direction of the sea. The river at night has its own particular sound. Not a loud sound. The Nile is too broad and too deep for the kind of rapid chatter that smaller rivers make. It is a deep, low, continuous sound, more felt than heard, the sound of enormous weight moving with complete assurance in one direction. The sound of something that has been doing the same thing for so long that it no longer requires any effort. The sound of absolute, settled, unhurried purpose. Let your breathing become that sound. Let each slow breath be the river moving north. Let each slow exhalation be the current finding its way around the gentle curves of the delta, spreading toward the sea. Let the body become heavy the way the river is heavy, full, patient, entirely sure of where it is going. The sea is very calm tonight. The harbor at Alexandria is black and silver. The lighthouse beam moves across the water in its slow circle, illuminating briefly and then passing on. The lighthouse that has been turning for centuries, that turned before her birth and went on turning after her death, that stands on its island as a testament to the idea that human beings can build things that endure, that can orient the lost, that can say to ships in the darkness, "Here is the shore, here is safety, here is home." The night is very still. The stars are very bright. And somewhere in the deepest part of the dark, where the past and the present touch each other and become the same thing, a lamp is burning, small and steady, warm. And someone is reading by its light, slowly, gently, in the oldest language in the world.